Before we begin, just a brief disclaimer. The following was recorded over the course of Tuesday and Wednesday, which is why it begins referencing the fact that the day is Tuesday, but this is actually being posted and uploaded late Wednesday night. I apologize for the terrible inconvenience. Enjoy. Good afternoon, everyone. It was really a gratifying experience to get the shiur out last night, and did already get some feedback from some who listened to it, and I really appreciate that. Someone even reached out with some substantive mechairis that perhaps I should have mentioned, and I do want to follow up a bit, just briefly, on yesterday's topic, but that would probably come at the end of this shiur, this installment, or if this topic ends up being split in half, split into two, then it might come at the end of the second installment. Now, in keeping with our theme of Bein Hametzarim, Chemdas Bein Hametzarim, today I would actually like to discuss the concept of Tikun Chatzos. I know it's not every day that Tikun Chatzos comes up in conversation, not necessarily a highly popular topic of discussion these days, but I think it's actually a very interesting topic. Of course, the connection to Bein Hametzarim, even if you're not aware of some of the information we will discuss Mirza Hashem imminently, but just using pure logic and deduction, surely you can realize that Tikun Chatzos is said to be somehow related to mourning the Churban, even if you've never actually taken a look. I'm sure most are aware that it relates to mourning the Churban, and Bein Hametzarim, of course, is the time of the year when we have the Churban on our minds. So that alone would probably be enough of a basis, but as we shall see, there actually is a specific connection between Tikun Chatzos and Bein Hametzarim. There's a particular minhag that I want to discuss. And actually, if you think about it, it's not just a current topic due to Bein Hametzarim, but actually, if you're keeping up with the shiur Tanya and Chida, Tanya, and you're learning the part of Tanya which is Igeres HaTshuva discusses various aspects and facets of the tshuva experience as taught by Chassidus, by the Rebbe. And I should mention that I have a lot of thoughts in general on Igeres HaTshuva, on the context, and on what the Chidushim are, what it's coming to say. That's for another occasion, for another discussion. But if you simply look at the part of Igeres HaTshuva that we are currently up to, so today we're concluding Perek Zayin, and if you look at the beginning of Perek Zayin from a few days ago, V'ulam derech ha'emes v'yasher lebchinas tshuva tata heim shnei dvarim derech klal ha'echad hu la'eder rachmim ha'yonim imikar ha'rachmim al nishmasai, etc. And when would you do that? Uzman ha'masugul azeh hu b'tikun chatzos k'mesha kasav b'sidr b'ha'ara ayin shom b'yurei. And here the Rebbe is actually mitzayin to his own sidr, which is something I want to get to as well in this discussion. So we know that Tanya was printed before the sidr, but Igeres HaTshuva Madura Basra, which is the Igeres HaTshuva we're familiar with, was printed afterwards. I'm not even looking into this, but this is just, I believe, correct and pasha to me, that at this point, Igeres HaTshuva, the Madura that we have in the common, obviously there's still a Madura Kama that you can track down if you're fascinated by how the Tanya was created in earlier drafts of Tanya. It's obviously not a very common topic. But when we say Igeres HaTshuva, that was, it's actually a comparatively late work of the Rebbe, and by then he could be mitzayin to the Siddur, K'mesh Kasav B'Siddur B'Ha'ara Ayin Shom B'Yurei. And as I'm saying that, I'm catching myself because I'm looking at the text of Tanya from a database. It's just easier to pull up. And I'm realizing that in the actual print of Tanya, it says K'mesh Kasav B'Siddur B'Ha'ara Ayin Shin Beis, and the traditional pianuach is Ayin Sham Ba'arucha, and the text of the database decided that the Beis is B'Yurei. So that's how, that's the influence of databases, and those are, that's the way how mistakes or shinuyim can creep in. At any rate, Then the Alter Rebbe quotes from Tikun Chatzos, "V'zeh shekasav sham nafla teres reishenu ein alonu ki chatanu." Alter Rebbe is quoting Tikun Chatzos like psukim. And I guess just on a simple level, Alter Rebbe seems to be making the point that even though Tikun Chatzos seems to be more cosmic in focus, but it's also the personal, and that's the ein alonu ki chatanu. So we are also in the picture. We are also a component in a dimension here. It's not just a story we're saying about Atzilus, but we down here in Amaza and our sins are part of the story, are part of the problem. So it would be appropriate at Tikun Chatzos. So that's the Chiddush here, that it's not just thinking about the Shechina, but that would be the right time to be Ma'ir Rachmim Hol Yoinim Memukar Harachmim Al Nishmasai. So that's one point right there in the beginning of Perek Zayin. So you see that Tikun Chatzos was an integral part of what the Alter Rebbe is talking about. Then the Alter Rebbe continues, Vasheni Levatish Lachni HaKlipa V'Sitra Achra. That's a separate track of the Avodah. In addition to Ma'ir Rachmim Hol Yoinim, it's a different focus, a different feeling. And how do you break such a achra? Kshallev nishbar v'nitka, v'ha'eich nishbar ha'lev v'nitka. Hinema atmezer, siguf Taanis, which is a big topic in Igeres HaTshuva, like as I alluded to earlier. We're not getting into that, but the whole role of siguf Taanis in Tshuva and in the Alter Rebbe's model of Tshuva. So that's part of it, but the Alter Rebbe seems to be minimizing it about Hinema atmezer. She'elenu koyach lis'anas harbe kedavar hamalach, ach ikar hachnas halev, etc. Hulius mimari the chushbenu ba'emek hadas lahamek daiter binose shah achas b'chol yoim oylaylo lefnei Tikun Chatzos. So once again, here the Alter Rebbe says this wouldn't be at Tikun Chatzos, but it would be prior to Tikun Chatzos, sort of getting yourself into the mode, into the mindset. Lisbainen b'mesh apal v'osa b'chata b'chinas geulah hashchina kanal, and again tying in your personal journey, your personal misdeeds and failings with the notion of geulah hashchina, which is the theme of Tikun Chatzos. And then just for contrast, in the continuation of Perek Zayin, which is closer to the part that was part of the shiur Tanya for today, the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that even someone who wasn't over on Kares, Aved Kares, Aved Misa B'dei Shamayim, but just Avedis Kalas, but even those can accumulate and can get pretty bad. And in any way, you see Chazal say that all kinds of Averis are like Averis Zara, and Geulah and Sheikhas Damim, etc. And here the Alter Rebbe connects it to Kriyas Shema Shalamita. That's why in Kriyas Shema Shalamita, there's that Yehiratzen with the Daled Mrs. Bastin. We're not going to get into a whole discussion about that, but it's there in the Siddur. So you bring Makabel, Daled Mrs., and yet we're not even talking about Averis Chamuras. It's about Mevatel Kriyas Shema, Tefillin, Tzitzis, Tefillah. And we're saying that's Chayev, Skila, Serefa, Herek, Chenek. At any rate, a bit of a contrast where there was this emphasis on Tikun Chatzos for the points being made at the beginning of the parak, and then at the end of the parak, there's this reference to Kriyas Shema Shalamita, clearly two distinct things, and the inyanim mentioned at the beginning were linked specifically to Tikun Chatzos. So Tikun Chatzos is, for starters, a major part of the Alter Rebbe's presentation in Tanya, particularly here in Tanya. It's also, as the Alter Rebbe himself mentioned, part of his Siddur, which I want to get to. So I think it deserves some discussion and some attention. And like I said, it's Bein Hametzarim, so even without the chassidic dimension, just the notion of the Churban, it seems to be appropriate for discussion at this time of year. So let's discuss it and focus on it a bit and see what we get to covering. But before we get too far into the topic, we probably need a bit of a quick primer on what is Tikun Chatzos, where did it come from, where did it originate, how did we get to where we are today. So there's an article in the journal Sinai, issue number Kuf Lamed Daled 134 by Yisrael Stiglitz, Tikun Chatzos geulah shel minhag. So I'm going to try to summarize as briefly as possible what the background is as presented there. And to be honest, what he's really doing is he's summarizing briefly things that Gershom Shalom wrote, Moshe Chalamish, and others. So this is really a kitzer of a kitzer. And essentially it all boils down to the fact that you have this Gemara, famous Gemara in the beginning of Brachas, Shalosh B'Shmaras Havi Alayla, The Eibishter cries and says, so the Eibishter is described as praving some kind of avelus for the Churban in the middle of the night. You also have a number of Mamari HaZoyar that describe the happenings in Shemayim at Chatzos. There's a lot on that. It seems like there are some earlier sources that describe various Chassidim, various groups of special people praving in Yonim in the middle of the night at Chatzos, perhaps Zemiris or Kinnis, things along those lines. But there actually was no organized Tikun Chatzos until the Arizal came along. The Arizal is the one who composed Tikun Chatzos as we know it, and it has two components. One part is called Tikun Rachel, and one part is called Tikun Leah, using Kabbalistic terminology. And within the Kabbalah's Arizal in particular, when you phrase it as Tikun Chatzos and Tikun Rachel and Tikun Leah, so perhaps even goes without saying that by Tikun we mean that rectifying things that are taking place in Atzilus. There's the Churban, there's the loss suffered spiritually by the deficits caused, the spiritual deficits caused by the Churban, and we, the person who's being Oirech Tikun Chatzos, or really according to Arizal, anyone who's doing mitzvahs or davening, is being Oirech Tikunim Lamaila. So this is the special Tikun of Chatzos, at which time there's Tikun Rachel and Tikun Leah. That's without even delving too deeply into the technicalities of how the Arizal would have explained it and presented it. After the Arizal composed it, apparently there are a number of layers to the Tikun as it appears in different Sidurim. There are just the Psukim, which is the core of Tikun Chatzos, and then there are Sidurim that added additional piyutim. I believe in the Siddur Chabad, it is more strictly according to the Arizal, and just Psukim and no piyutim, but others did have piyutim. From here, the article actually goes on to discuss the Shabtai Tzvi angle, which is something I did want to touch on here, but I think I will save that point for a bit later when we get to that. Interestingly, the next thing he cites is actually the Alter Rebbe in Igeres HaTshuva, Perek Zayin, and what the Alter Rebbe says about Igeres HaTshuva, and this idea about how the Alter Rebbe is bringing it back around to the person's own tikkun, working on yourself, and how that plays into the larger concept of Tikun Chatzos. I think in some of the earlier sources cited in the article, perhaps pre-Arizal, there also were allusions to the idea of taking the time to think about yourself, your own Averis. So it's not a completely novel idea of the Alter Rebbe, and it's really probably, you could say, perhaps a rope that gets pulled in different directions over the centuries, and often there's more emphasis on the person himself, and then perhaps there's a pull in the other direction, but the two things are never too far apart from each other, is my impression. So now, armed with this information, let's pedal back to the Bein Hametzarim angle, to the Bein Hametzarim tie-in. So if you look in the Kisvei Arizal on Bein Hametzarim, and we already discussed a bit of it in the previous discussion with regards to Pri Chadash and Levush Chadash, that's mentioned in Kisvei Arizal. So if you look, I'm using, I don't know if I mentioned yesterday, I'm using the Shemayna She'arim of Reb Chaim Vital himself, as printed in the last decade or so by Machon Ahavat Shalom. It's just a joy and a pleasure to look at and to learn. It's, to discuss all the different editions, Mahaduras of Kisvei Arizal, and all the overlap, and to explain which was printed when and who had what and when. That would be way beyond the scope of the discussion here. Maybe it's something we should discuss at some point for the benefit of the listeners, because it's kedai to have a Clarkite. But all you have to know for the purpose of this discussion is that our Shmeina She'arim from Reb Chaim Vital, it's his Madura Basra of the Teiras Arizal, and one of the She'arim is Shar HaTfilah, and that's where he put all the Tfilah related, and I guess you could say perhaps also the cycle of the year related stuff. This stuff you would ordinarily find in Pri Etz Chaim, and there's obviously a lot of overlap, but here you're seeing it straight from Reb Chaim Vital. Pri Etz Chaim was one editor, as we discussed yesterday, of Yaakov Tzemach's particular edit based on whatever writings he had, which may or may not have been the Madura Basra. So again, a lot of overlap, but I'm looking at Shar Tefillah right now. So in Bein Hametzarim, V'heim Chof Aleph Yomim Shebein Yud Zayin L'Tammuz Ad Tisha B'Av, Zokt Reb Chaim Vital, understood to be B'Shem Harizal, Minhag Toiv V'Kosher Hu Ma'oid L'Chol Ba'al Nefesh Lashavas ba'avelos achar chatzi hayoim b'chol elu hayomim. V'lufkes b'chia mamish al churban habayis. It's a great minhag for any bal nefesh to prave avelos at chatzos of the day throughout these days and to cry for real about the churban. What's the significance of chatzos of the day? Because chatzos of the day also has Kabbalistic significance. So it's a time when the shadows are creeping in, and that alludes to din. So chatzos is a time of din, and that's in fact the reason why we find that the heichel was burned after chatzos. And he adds, and this is very good, very important for the person's nefesh. Again, the person's nefesh and the cosmic dimension are always intertwined, and the derech of the Arizal was also a derech for the nefesh Adam in his way, in his signoin. And the Hachaim adds, I don't have to mention chatzos halayla, of course, you're being misabel every night, doing Tikun Chatzos every night. It doesn't even mention Tikun Chatzos here for the night, but surely it's kind of understandable. So surely these nights you should be adding and crying. Olav Nemar, Simchus Yerushalayim v'chulu kolam es ablam oleha. And then the next passage, the last bit of Inyan Bein Hametzarim, is about the Pri Chadash and the Levush Chadash that we were discussing. So he mentions that Chatzos Laila in Tzarech Laskir, obviously you know. And in addition, there's also an Inyan of Chatzos Hayom. So we know Chatzos Laila. He doesn't mention it, but obviously, surely he's referring to Tikun Chatzos, which Arizal was metaken. The question is, what does he have in mind exactly for Chatzos Hayom? So if you take a look at contemporary Svarim that are written on the topic of Bein Hametzarim, so for example, I've mentioned Nitei Gavriel. So if you take a look at Nitei Gavriel, already in Chelik Aleph, in the Pischa Zeira, in his wind-up, before he gets to the halachas, he already has a section about Amiras Tikun Chatzos Bein Hametzarim, and he begins by quoting from the Arizal. Here he quotes from Shara Kavanas, which I think he means the Shmeina Sh'arim of Shmuel Vital, but it's alt ain't. And by the way, let me just correct myself now in real time. I said before Pri Chaim is Yaakov Tzemach, but actually the common Pri Chaim is the edit of Rameir Poppers, and the Hagah of Yaakov Tzemach that was under discussion was apparently not in the common editions of Pri Chaim, but it seems to me that in some edition in the last few decades they inserted the Hagahs of Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach from, I think, his draft, his edit of the Pri Chaim, and that's what made its way into the databases, which is where I saw it when I was looking it up. Akopanim, it's a little bit more complicated, Nishnageya, but I just wanted to correct myself on the author, the editor of the Pri Chaim. The common Pri Chaim Grada is Rameir Poppers. Anyway, so you have this passage that's in Pri Chaim, it's in Shara Kavanas of Shmuel Vital, it's in Shara Tefillah of Chaim Vital. This idea about Minik Teva Kosher, Lashavas Ba'avelos, Achar Chatzi Hayoim. So he quotes that. And Kavayasher mentions this. He writes, V'chein Nagu Bekilas Kadoshis B'chol Makim. This is V'chein Kasav HaChida and Meira Ba'etzba, which is the Chida's simple, straightforward halachas, halichas, and minhagim. Chida writes, Toiv Leimar Seder Tikun Rachel. So the first portion of Tikun Chatzos, B'chol Yoim Choil, Mi Bein Hametzarim, Achar Chatzos. So it's a good thing to do, to read that part of Tikun Chatzos every day, at Chatzos of the day. V'chein Nagu B'eretz Yisrael, so this is a special minhag attested to by the Chida, and he's messiah here as well to the Chida elsewhere in Shem Agdoilim, Arechus Svarim, and the Erech of Kitzur Takvei Kayin. So he quotes the Chida saying, you should know that in Eretz Yisrael, Akom is Ablim, Allah Churban, and we say Tikun Chatzos, Ubimei Bein Hametzarim, Bebeis HaKnesses Agdoila, etc. Nesafim B'yoim Kol Gadol u'Mekaynim u'Boichem B'chol Yoim K'mitzvahs Rabbeinu Harizal. So it doesn't mention Tikun Chatzos necessarily per se, but Chida also mentioned there in Shem Agdoilim that you should know that in Eretz Yisrael everyone gathers in the big shul and the smaller shuls, and they are Mekaynim u'Boichem. And Nitei Gavriel continues, V'chein Kasav Pir Megadam, B'chai Adam, B'chol HaPaiskim. I'm not checking all the sources, but The Chida clearly is a central source on this, and it gets mentioned elsewhere as well. Yaakov Hillel mentions, he's probably quoting from somewhere else, a lot of this information probably is copied from Sefer to Sefer, that in Chutz La'aretz, the Sfardim Taka had this minhag to do Tikun Chatzos in the shuls in the afternoon, at Chatzos, and he mentioned specifically Jerba and Tunis, people will close their stores and come and take their shoes off and do Tikun Rachel, and he says this was also the minhag of the Yeshivas Hamekubalim in Ungarn, in Hungary. Until then, he immediately goes on to describe the Chassam Sofer. Taka sounds like he did it by Rabbim, but it sounds like he's referring to doing it at night, Thursday night. They would do a whole Tikun Chatzos together in the yeshiva. He discusses the Maram Shik as well. Then he goes on and says that even though I mentioned later in the Sefer, in the chapter devoted to this topic, the B'Shem talmidei Abal Shem Tov, that they would not do Tikun Chatzos by Rabbim, and the Yaakov Hillel, of course, is, I guess, like many, maybe he's caught between minhag Ungarn and minhagim Chassidim. And Kanir, the implied question is not just technical at all. They didn't happen to have this minhag, but it's mashma that by Chassidim, it's not a chassidische Zach to prave Tikun Chatzos in this way. So Yaakov Hillel, he quotes the Yitaf Panim, the B'Shem the Chayz of Lublin, who told the Yismach Moshe that Taminu lanu glei bunds mir sagen Tikun Chatzos b'chia b'hesped, and yet hakol b'simcha. So there's this idea in Chassidus to be shoyl avelos, but at the same time you are mourning the churban, and at the same time it's b'simcha. So trying to balance that, Chassidus has maybe a bit more anxiety about being misabel correctly as opposed to incorrectly, but ultimately it's supposed to somehow balance itself all out with b'chia and simcha. And then Yaakov Hillel says that even the tzaddikim that didn't see Tikun Chatzos at all, but zicher, they were always davening for the geulah, and they were looking forward to Mashiach's arrival, and came across in their Torah, and that's for tzaddikim, but for anoshim pshutim like us, halavai, we should stick to the Shulchan Aruch k'pshuta, and we should be misabel and bein hametzarim, and we should say Tikun Chatzos. So he's being ma'orer taka that was so kaven kedai for Stam mention, even after whatever Chassidus came and innovated, it would be the right thing to bring back Tikun Chatzos. And he references the Luach Dover Be'itoy, Rabbi Genuth, who apparently writes or wrote in his Luach that Chaval, that Tikun Chatzos seems to still be going out of style, and halavai, it would be nice if we could bring it back in style. And if you have a teretz that already Tikun Chatzos at night is already completely out of style and people are sleeping, but what's your teretz for the day? So it's kedai to bring it back, and even if you can't do it at Chatzos exactly, so do it before Mincha. Ad Khan, what he writes in the Pischa Zeira, I'll just add on my own that I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think growing up many years ago in Borough Park, I seem to remember that there may have been signs up about Tikun Chatzos during the day will take place in this shul, but I'm not 100% sure about that, and I don't know if it's ongoing, I don't know who was behind it, I don't know how popular it was, but epis gedenkt sich that there was such a musig. And then again, in the Sefer itself, he touches on this in Perek Chav Daled, and Haggis Tevis Bein Hametzarim, Aleph Roi v'noch l'chol adam she's abel b'yom elu b'chol yoyim k'chatzi shah b'chatzos hayoyim u'v'kam mekaymes haminig lasas Tikun Chatzos barabim v'yesh eminim she'en lasas barabim. And for the Makar to be misabel in general, he's been to the Magen Avraham and Aruch HaShulchan Mishnah Berurah, all b'shem the Arizal, so that vart from the Arizal made its way into the Sifrei Halacha. Quotes from the Adaras. The Adaras, in his, sounds like it's one of his diaries, says that I would takatu Tikun Chatzos kedas Arizal all arichos. Then he quotes Sefer L'Kutim Yukarim that Ramatl of Slonim said that the talmidei Abal Shem Tov would always do Tikun Chatzos, which isn't a chiddush. Like I said, you see where Tanya is coming from. Tikun Chatzos was indeed a given, but I'm not sure what this has to do directly with the topic at hand. We're talking about Bein Hametzarim, we're talking about the day, but I guess he's just trying to bolster that Tikun Chatzos has a chashva pedigree. And then with regards to the Rabbim, again he quotes from the Shem Agdolim, the Chida, the Erech for Kitzur Takvei Koyin, about the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, other Makairis that mention this practice to do it by day, to do Tikun Chatzos by Rabbim. And again, he mentions the minhag in Hungary. And then, with regards to the Yesh Emim She'ein, so here he actually cites a few Makaitis, which he had been referencing earlier. He says that here is where he brings Makaitis. So one Makar is the Munkatcher, the Hachaim, the Shalom. He says the Munkatcher, Kairei Tagar. He has negative things to say about the fact that Beglilus Elyon, Pashtus, that's a translation of Oberlander in Hungary, the more Yakisha Chalakim of Hungary. They had this minhag to do Tikun Chatzos Bein Hametzarim, and the Munkatcher, who was a Galician, he had the more chassidic sensibility, he said that doesn't feel right, doesn't have the right vibe. Yesh Dovid Amasel Alev Beinoyu Bein Koinoy V'Lei B'Tzibur V'Chabura Pashat Pasnish. The whole thing, it's not the right format. That was the Munkatcher's take. Then he cites another mucker that I've seen cited in a number of places, that in the Shut Afrakasa Tanya, he says, I heard from my father-in-law, I heard from the Imre Yosef Spinka, B'Shem Rabbaisov, Shekol Minhagim Arizal, all the things that Arizal says to do, which the Baal Shem Tov did not follow. So, for example, Tikun Chatzos by day, Bein Hametzarim, so the Baal Shem Tov cut it out, we don't do it. Like I said, this is cited in a number of Svarim and Bein Hametzarim. Another sefer I was looking at is a Terrace Pause on Bein Hametzarim by Pinchas Zvichi. It's a name you might come across if you hang out long enough in Yitzhak Chachma. So he has a sefer on halachas van hagas of Yimei Bein Hametzarim. So he has a section there on Tikun Chatzos as well, and he presents this minhag as the proper thing to do. Yimei Bein Hametzarim, Leigim Leim Tikun Chatzos Gam B'Yoyim, and it's Chatzos Hayoyim. And this is the minhag in Yerushalayim, the very makbid, to do this Tikun Chatzos Bein Hametzarim by day. Chassidus Hashem, it's we've got it to spread in a number of kehillas in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. It's even places where they hadn't done it before, and we should get people involved. And B'chalal, to be nizr to see Tikun Chatzos during Bein Hametzarim, even if you're not the type that says it throughout the entire year. And the footnote cites some of the Makairis we already saw. Arizal Shar Kavanas points out, he concedes that Grada Arizal does not actually say what you should be doing Achar Chatzos Hayoyim, but the Chida already attested to the fact that the minhag is to say Tikun Rachel. He tells us about what they did in Eretz Yisrael. And in another footnote, he quotes again from the Chida and Sefer Shem Agdailim, the Erech for Kitzur Takfikayin about in Eretz Yisrael, what they do. And I want to get to this, I want to discuss this Chida in greater detail because there's something interesting and intriguing about it. Nishtazei Pashat, what the Chida is saying there and why he's saying it. But before I get to that, I saw that he's mitzayin here to an interesting point, shtickle from Hagrich, Beis Chaim, by which he means what the Welt calls the Ben Ish Chai. So the Ben Ish Chai, in one of his Svarim, his Sefer Oid Yosef Chai, Parshas Vayishlach, he quotes, the author quotes in the footnote as follows from that Sefer. And the truth is that he quotes it Bekitzer, and actually wanted to see it in the original context, so I took a look in the Makar, and it's much more barichas. Obviously, we can't let that completely take over our discussion, but I will actually be quoting from the source directly. This is what the Ben Ish Chai writes. He begins by introducing it and giving some background, but I'm going to go straight to, he says he's going to copy the Shaila and Shuva word for word. He says, Shaila, Nish'alti mi'ish mevim, I was asked by an intelligent person, and that person asked, and that person himself seems to say that Shal mimeni ish pashet v'yedei sefer ma'at. So it sounds like he's asking himself on behalf of a friend. So often with the Ben Ish Chai, you can't even know whether really he's asking the question himself. But etzem, we know this perhaps from the case of the Shas at Shuvas Teidel Lishma, in which he seems to attribute questions and answers to an alter ego. But so asking on behalf of a friend, who knows? Anyway, show me many ish pashat v'yedei sefer ma'at, that Baruch Hashem, I've learned Medrash and Agada and a little Gemara, Nister, not at all. But I do read from the Zohar and Tikkunim, which was the common minhag in many Bedinis. People used to read the Zohar like others read Tehillim. And now I have some questions, and if you can please answer and address my questions. Number one, what's L'Shem Yichud, Kutshabrichu, Shchinte? What is the Shchinte? What are we supposed to be thinking when we say Kutshabrichu, Ushechinte? Let me just interject the mention that I was talking to someone recently, and one of the popular Daf Yomi Shiurim recently did a discussion, maybe even a series, on L'Shem Yichud in Halacha, the discussions in Halacha about reciting L'Shem Yichud. So the person who was mentioning this to me said that when he heard this discussion, when the topic came up, it was sort of the first time that he even realized what the words of the Shem Yichud are, that we're saying Yichud, Kudsha Brichu, Usha Chinte. Meaning, I think someone who grows up within Chabad, I would imagine, if you have a traditional classic Chabad education, I don't know if you can give a shiur on Yichud, Kudsha Brichu, Usha Chinte, but I think at the very least you would notice the three concepts, Yichud, Kudsha Brichu, Usha Chinte. You would have some vague notion of what that's supposed to mean. But it was just interesting to hear from someone from beyond that community where maybe he says L'Shem Yichud, maybe he doesn't. He surely saw it around. Mamish is nicht eingefallen. What do we even say? Yichud Kutchebrichu Shechinte. It's completely novel. So here in the Yosef Chai, the question was, what's Taka Pshat Kutchebrichu Shechinte, and what do we mean when we say the Shechina? But already Chazal mentioned the Shechina a lot, and surely in Zayir and Tikkunim there's plenty. What are we talking about? The second question is, what's all these zivug l'mayla, zocher nekeva? Sensitive question. Number 3, Tikun Chatzos, we have Tikun Rachel, Tikun Leah. Who's Rachel, who's Leah? What are we talking about? Which is also of interest, more direct relevance to our discussion here presently. And the fourth question, which was quoted in that sefer, and why I'm sharing this right now, says, we don't really understand the side, the mystical dimension of Tikun Chatzos, which is a mystical tefillah fundamentally. There's no real pshat level to it. I mean, I guess one can just think about the Churban, but as I have acknowledged directly here in this discussion from the beginning, it's very obviously should not be mistaken for anything other than Kabbalistic rite. So, as someone who doesn't understand the mysticism, and the person who's saying Tikun Chatzos, who's reciting it, is not doing it properly, and not crying, and not full of tsar, which is how the Arizal conveyed how it's supposed to be said, and you're stam reciting words, and your mind is elsewhere, and from beginning to end doesn't even take 5 minutes, and it's like reading the Fim Uksuvim, and you have no idea what you're saying. Interesting analogy. What are we accomplishing? Better not to read it. And like I said, I don't know who the person asking the question was, but it could be the Ben Ish Chai could have asked the question even without anyone posing the question directly to him. It probably was and is a common question, a common concern, perhaps parallel to some of the concerns Taka in the chassidic movement, where, especially when it came to Yonim like Churban and Avelis, if you're all depressed, Chassidus has a problem with that. And if you're not depressed and you're stam saying it, so weiter, what are you accomplishing? These are certain anxieties that were heightened to a greater degree in certain times in certain places. And the Ben Ish Chai is sort of confronting and acknowledging this question, Taka. His chug and his community, I guess, it was more common just to say it, but it was also common for people to say without any special Kavana. It's just part of the heritage, part of tradition. Okay, now Tikun Chatzos got added to the things that we need to sort of say half mindlessly. B'shlama tefillah and shar mitzvahs. What about all of those? No, tzarech l'espalel v'lasas ha-mitzvahs. You have to do it anyway. So even if you don't do it with the right kavana, it's a chiyuv. But Tikun Chatzos isn't a chiyuv. M'chatchila, it seems to have been intended to capture a certain emotion. So if the kavana is missing and the tzar and the bechir are lacking, so is there really any point? Are you really accomplishing anything? What was the point of adding this? And like I said, this is perhaps a more general question that many have had at different times and in different places, as to, things get added along the way, and surely when they were added, there was a certain degree of inspiration, and now the question is, why are we still doing this? You could say this about piyutim and davening in general. There are those who are into piyutim, those that said, at some point, maybe we should cut the piyutim out. You have kinnis on Tisha B'Av. Obviously, some people are more into kinnis than others. But here, specifically, Tikun Chatzos is even in a category of its own. It's even less of a chiyuv, feels even less binding. So what's the point? And there are other bakashas as well. Yeheirava, you don't even know what you're saying. It's in Aramaic. What's the point of saying it if you're not fully present? That's the question. So the Ben Ish Chai responds to the first question, with tremendous arichas, gives a crash course in Kabbalah. We're not going to get into that. The second question about the zocher and quotes from Yosef Irgas, Shem Ramunim, which is perhaps a topic we should get to one day, that whole chapter in history and the controversies that were taking place with Nehemiah Chiyun, that whole chapter. Anyway, so he quotes from him about Zachar and Nekeva and Zivugim. Third question, Tikun Rachel, Tikun Leah. So even though that's not the reason why I looked this up, but since we're already discussing it, how does the Ben Ish Chai explain the musik of Tikun Rachel and Tikun Leah? So the Ben Ish Chai says, I already explained to you earlier about the Bechin of Malchus, and the Oishei Achreina of Yud Kevavke, and it has many names, Shemus, Kinuyim, Tayarim. So one of those Shemus and Kinuyim is that it's called Rachel. And there's also a part of it that's called Leah. And I can't explain to you the details, but all you have to know is that Rachel and Leah are Tayarim and Shemus of the Malchus Holyayna, otherwise known as the Shechina. And the actual Leah and Rachel, our Imois, our matriarchs, the wives of Yaakov Yisrael, they were called Leah and Rachel al Shem, Shemus Holyayna Mahem, Shenikris Behem Malchus Holyayna. They're named after the names of Malchus, because one taka had a chelik gadol of the chelik of Malchus, it's called Leah. The other had a chelik from Rachel. That is why they had those names, Al Shem, the mucker. And now when Yidden sin, so they're pagan in Malchus, which is called Shechina, and there's the chelik of Rachel and the chelik of Leah. And when you are doing Torah mitzvahs and tefillah, so you're doing tikkunim, like I mentioned earlier, this notion, this term of tikkun in the Arizal and Kabbalistic terminology, you're being metaken the spheres of Atzilus, you're being Moisef Eiris in Atzilus. So Tikun Chatzos has Tikun Rachel, you're being metaken the part of Malchus that's called Rachel, and it has Tikun Leah to be metaken the part of Malchus that's called Leah. And of course, there's much, much more depth to this whole topic, which this is not the format for. I'm not going to elaborate. Ayoy Bazoy, really getting back to the question is, why are you doing it, if I can't explain to you? Ata tasel adas Rabbi v'Rabbeinu Harizal she'asu seder atikunim ha'ela al pi hatayim ha'gluim lahem. You're doing it ledas, you're whatever they had in mind, so it's like you're being mechaven to whatever they had in mind, and that's enough. And the fourth question about Kavana Machshava, so who does the Ben Ish Chai quote? Who does he quote to friend for this kasha? He quotes Hagoin Reb Chaim Zal ben Nefesh Hachaim. He quotes Reb Chaim Volozhiner in the Sefer Nefesh Hachaim. Now, as we know, and perhaps the Ben Ish Chai was aware himself, Sefer Nefesh Hachaim is a sefer that essentially covers the same topics of Sefer Tanya, but it's really essentially a response and a rebuttal to Sefer Tanya and to the chassidic movement generally. So it covers things in there that aren't necessarily mentioned explicitly in Tanya. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner, his form of Hisnagdus, often it's argued that Reb Chaim Volozhiner was a much more reasonable and cool-headed Misnagid, not the hot-headed ones, the Kanoim. But Reb Chaim decided to meet Chassidus on its own turf. He's going to write a sefer, he's going to be Isaac in the same Noisim, in the same Sugyas, and he's going to explain why Misnagdim disagree with Chassidim on the very issues that Chassidus is quoting and citing as proof and demonstration of its principles. So one of the things that Reb Chaim Volozhiner discusses in Nefesh Hachaim is the inyan of Kavana and Lishma. Just as I alluded to earlier, one of the big Taanis of Chassidus is that people are talking not doing things with the right Kavana and the right Pnimius. They're not fully present. They're not fully involved in the thing that they're doing. So you have to take the time, right? So why are you davening by Riches Lamashal? So one way of explaining that would be that, why are we starting late? Is because stam to daven and go through the motions, it has to be a real davening. How are we going to make it a real davening? So I'm going to spend a lot of time in preparation, or I'll spend a lot of time in the middle of davening. So that's just a fundamental yisoid of what's fueling the dark Chassidus. And the Nefesh Hachaim is trying to neutralize and fight that off. So what does he do? What does he say? And this is what the Ben Ish Chai is quoting. And I guess you could say, there's obviously a larger issue, and that both aside the Ben Ish Chai, who belongs to the Chug Hamekubalim, that consider themselves the Mamshichei Darko of the Arizal, the Yeshivas Hamekubalim in Yerushalayim, the Rashash, and all the prominent members of that yeshiva. I believe the Ben Ish Chai is considered affiliated with that wing, so they consider themselves the proper, mainstream, straightforward, uncomplicated mamshichim of the Arizal. And obviously, Chassidus in its way saw itself as a hemshech, perpetuating the principles of the Arizal with new dimensions. And the Vilna Gaon and Chaim Volozhiner were also Mekubalim and also in their own way being mamshech in the derech of the Arizal. And it seems that perhaps in some of these senses and some of these issues, the geulah and the Chaim Volozhiner attack a closer in spirit to the more traditional approach of those Mekubalim, although it's probably more complicated than that. But it's just interesting to see how Ben Ish Chai seems to feel naturally allied with what the Nefesh Hachaim is saying here. So it quotes the Nefesh Hachaim. Nefesh Hachaim says that we already said the main thing is the maisa. Whatever you do, you have to have taras hamachshava. You want to have your thoughts clear and proper and focused. That's just mitzdaref. It's not ma'akev. Brings a few ayahs from Shas. It says in Nazir, if you eat the Pesach l'shem achila gasa, nehidu like ka'avid mitzvah min amuvcher, but Pesach miya ka'avid. So avada zicher if you want to think machshavas, but the yakshav adam be'es chiv akravas haPesach ve'es chiv achilas Kavanas neirais shel inyan haPesach v'machshava gevayas shebegvayas v'toheres shebetoheres. So you go all out on the Kavanas. If you don't actually do the Quran, so which is a bit of a straw man, because Chassidus as well, I'm sure anyone familiar, certainly the way it's taught today, that same point is always emphasized, that the Iker is the Maisa, and if you have all the Kavanas, you don't have the Etzem Zach. But in the earlier Dairis of Chassidus, there was a bit more of, there was a bit of a tenua in which it seemed that some people, some of the time, seem to put precedent on the Kavanas over the Maisa. Hopefully it wasn't too common to actually skip the Etzem Mitzvah, but there might be a story here and there that suggested that wasn't completely unheard of. So maybe it wasn't a complete straw man. Anyway, so Chaim Volozhiner is saying, you see in halacha that the Iker is the Maisa, and the Kavana without the Maisa gets you nowhere. And he goes on. Ben Ish Chai is still quoting Nefesh Hachaim. He quotes Gantz Arichas from there. This is, by the way, from the Sefer Nefesh Hachaim in Chela Gimel. So there's a section of 8 prakim in which that's essentially the Bavusta section in which Nefesh Hachaim really goes after Chassidus, really almost attacks Chassidus frontally. So just for the record, to know where the Ben Ish Chai is getting his inspiration from. It's just interesting to note. At any rate, the Nefesh Hachaim is mamshech and says, so now that we established that's the case with mitzvahs, not just mitzvahs, but also tefillah, even though tefillah is called Avodah Shebelev, and Chazal Silav de B'chalav Avchem, of course, Chassidus quotes this a lot, but in Kol Zois, the halacha is, you have to say every word, and that's all you really need to have, ultimately, at the end of the day, and Gam Li'kuva, Di'avid, if you have all the kavanas, because you said it's Avodah Shebelev, so I'm being mahar belev, you're not yoytze at all, and you have to daven again, or if you missed the zman, so it's haste that you taka missed it, and you would have to be mispal shtayim tefillah sha'achareh, kedin mishalei spal koliker, and even al pi kabbalah sa'arizal, the whole tikkun of tefillah dafka is through akima svasav, the way he quotes the way the Arizal explains the significance of that. In the model of tikkunim of the Arizal, the dibur plays an important role. So even the shitas chem, if you're Arizal nikas, so dafka the Arizal says, again, kind of a straw man, because no one ever really came out and said that genug to daven machshava not bedibur. But again, weiter, it's can sein that there were certain dogmas, exceptions in which maybe certain grace mentioned Chassidim Taka forgot, didn't get around to saying the Verter. We know there's a Ma'aser of the Rebbe Rashab, where he was told about a great chassid from the early Doiris, from the Alter Rebbe, and about how he might have, on Yom Kippur, not have gotten around to actually saying the words, and the Rebbe Rashab said, can't be. But there's someone just shared the other day from outside of Chabad, a similar sipur. So, Kapanim, the stories existed, what those people actually did, what actually happened, but in the Chassidish Welt and the surroundings, there certainly were Azalcha Maisis and Azalcha Grace mentioned, maybe a Taka Shtickle Wild also, Wilde Grace mentioned, that people believed that it was believable that it could happen, that maybe on Yom Kippur or whatever, but they never got around to saying the actual words. So anyways, so you see, even like that Izal, you need to have the dibur. If you don't have the dibur, so the whole thing's missing. If you said the dibur and you're lacking the machshava, even though it's taka nicht v'yistarv zu sein, but in calls it analytic, meaning lav daf according to Arizal, were you metaken what you need to be metaken either. But either way, if you just do dibur without machshava without dibur, either way you're not going to be maybe metaken what you need to be metaken according to Arizal. But at least with dibur without machshava, at least you're yaitza. And you were mekayim and metaken certain parts of the tefillah lefida Arizal. And I'm just being mekatzer. The Nefesh Hachaim goes on barichas. The Ben Ish Chai quotes it all barichas. This is from that section of Chele Gimel, Perek Hey and Perek Vav. So after quoting this at length, the Ben Ish Chai says, Ad kan l'shoin narav b'nefesh Hachaim. And what he says, Taka, is very correct, very geschmack, and he has even more there on this. And this is enough for now. So Lafid Varav Elu, so you see your Tanya in the fourth question about Tikun Chatzos as well. There's also the Tanya Sayetzer, so the Ben Ish Chai, even though the Nefesh Hachaim wasn't Taka discussing Tikun Chatzos at all, that's Taka the Taanis Esther that wants to move out to you from Kiyum Mitzvah to Dvarim Shevukdusha. And God, if you think about it, Lav Nafka the Nefesh Hachaim would have held that Tikun Chatzos is for the masses. Tikun Chatzos is Taka Nish Chiyuv. The Nefesh Hachaim is building his whole Tanya based on Chiyuvim and Halacha, Mitzvahs, Tefillah, Yoitze Zayin. So it's very, very possible, and here's maybe where the Ben Ish Chai and the Nefesh Hachaim Taka would not be on the same page, that for all we know, the Nefesh Hachaim would have said, whoever said that Tikun Chatzos is for the masses. Chassidus, in part, was popularizing things for the masses. It happens to be that in that sense, Chassidus might be closer to the Chemdas Hamekubalim, those communities, because a lot of Arizal stuff was very popular for all members of society in the Chemdas Hamekubalim's communities as well. So in that sense, maybe Chassidus and Mekubalim are closer, whereas the minhagim were further from that, because they seem to be more opposed to integrating certainly Nusach Arizal into davening and stuff like that. It would be interesting to check whether Sidurim Nusach Ashkenaz tended to include Tikun Chatzos or not. My guess is more likely that not, but maybe there are exceptions. That would be my guess. Certainly till today, as I mentioned, and I want to get back to, Siduri Chabad still have Tikun Chatzos in them. I assume that Siduri Asfardim, certainly those with a bent towards following Zayin or Izal, I would imagine might also have Tikun Chatzos, and I imagine that Stama Nusach Ashkenaz doesn't have Tikun Chatzos. I haven't gone and checked this though before making that claim. If I'm wrong, I would be happy to be corrected. But certainly the vibe, the atmosphere you get from the so-called Litvische Oilam, the Yeshivas Welt, who see themselves as being mamshich, the ethos of the Yeshivas and Litta, which all trace themselves back to Chaim Belazhener, and it's more complex because the whole Kabbalistic dimension is mostly missing there, and the Geulah Chaim Belazhener did have this Kabbalistic dimension, and in fact, they say on the Vilna Gaon that his greatest output is Bechlal and Kabbalah, even though the Welt doesn't necessarily realize it, and that's not his branding, which is its own discussion. But could Taka be that Reb Chaim Belazhener Welt gehalten that it's Taka only for the elites, and he was defending the establishment in those parts of the world where the less chassidic inclined, less Kabbalistic inclined, gehalten Taka that probably were some Rabbanim and Hachaim that didn't learn Nister at all in Lano Esek B'Nestaris, and certainly at least the Hamayinam was not considered relevant to the Hamayinam. So it's just interesting and perhaps a little ironic that Ben Ish Chai is citing the Nefesh Hachaim as proof that you should say Tikun Chatzos even without Kavana. So in essence, that would mean there are three shittas. According to Chaim Belazhener, you shouldn't say Tikun Chatzos Bechlal unless you have a tremendous shaykhs to it. Chassidus, at least earlier on, at gehalten that Tikun Chatzos is for everyone, and everyone should work on their previous, on their Kavana. The Ben Ish Chai holds that everyone should say Tikun Chatzos whether or not the Haltz Beit Sinisht. It's interesting that it seems at this point in time, though, Chassidus has moved on, and as I guess we want to discuss, Tikun Chatzos isn't really much of a thing anymore, and it's not really considered shaykh to the Rabbim. So it's just interesting to sort of track different trends and groupings and classifications and how things can even change within a particular group. The Ben Ish Chai Firzois here in the section of Yeshivas Hamekubalim Beit Hiniki Kein Ata Hashayel Afilu Yiyah Lipcha Toret Harbe Al Tavat Talmidei Tikun Chatzos, and you should say everything, and of course you should work on your Kavana, your machshava. May Hashem help you. Now, while I'm tempted to actually go down, as the expression these days goes, down the rabbit hole, and see what else has been said about this Nefesh Hachaim and about this Ben Ish Chai and Tikun Chatzos, but I feel like I really should leave this line of discussion, this thread, at this for now, and it definitely, I think, gives us some general insight into the discussion at hand, attitudes towards Tikun Chatzos and what the point is and what you're trying to accomplish, and it's helpful generally to the conversation, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. If anyone has any haris or wants to hear more on this topic, or would like to hear more detailed exploration of this topic, feel free to let me know. I'll just note that at the beginning of this Yeshivas Hamekubalim Parshas Vayishlach, the way he got into it, is this minyan Tikun Rachel. I wrote him Ben Ish Chai in this parsha, Mashat Tzarech Ha'adam L'chaven Kavanas Pshutas Hanis Kodem Dovid Rabbeinu Harizal B'Shar Kavanas. Some simple kavanas for Tikun Chatzos. You have to cry about Seifas HaTorah, and that Seifas HaTorah were given to the Chitzonim, which is called geulah HaShechina, and to cry about the Churban Beis Hamikdash when you say the Mizmor al Naras Bavel, and to cry about the Tzadikim who were killed when you say the Mizmor La'asaf Filikim Bo Goyim Benach Lasacha. So he's starting off by alluding to the fact that there is also, within Kavana, there are levels and layers, and not everyone's being mechaven the elaborate Kavanas of the Arizal, but it still has meaning and significance on a more pashita level. And then from there, he says Valzen Ish Alti, and he says it's in the Rav Pa'alim as well. B'chol that this person said B'chol Zman She'emet Tikun Rachel Einim Mis'er B'vchia, doesn't feel the tsar. So what's the point? And then he goes and quotes the entire Shaila and Shuvah Barichas that we just discussed. And though I just pledged not to really delve and drill down too much into the Nefesh Hachaim, but I guess I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Nachum Greenwald has a classic article in Heichal HaBesht, issue number 5, Hashpois Chassidus B'Sifrei Nefesh Hachaim V'Ruach Chaim. He points out direct parallels between Nefesh Hachaim and Tanya, often, most of the time, and which isn't really surprising, but often what's surprising is that they almost are essentially saying the same thing or appearing to say the same thing. So Nachum Greenwald points out that when Nefesh Hachaim has his whole arichas attacking the notion that you would just be Yotze v'machshava v'hirer, so Nachum points out that if you look in Tanya, Perek Lamed Ches, Perek Lamed Tes, there's a very similar sequence. The Rebbe says that now we'll understand the Taka the Halacha, the Hirer Lav Kedibur Dam, Vim Kara Kriyash V'machshavte, Beliber Levad, B'chol Koyach Kavanasei, Layotze, De Chivasei, you Taka when I Yotze, and same with Berachas Hamazon, and Brachas, the Rabbanon, B'Tefillah, and Vim Haitzi B'Svasav, V'Loi Kiven Liba, and if you did say the words, you did have Kavana, you were Yotze B'Diyeva, you don't have to go back. So the Rebbe is also making the exact same point, just not rhetorically, and not to prove a point, and not to disprove a point. The Rebbe is just saying it b'pshitus. Like, of course you have to say it. Of course you wouldn't be Yotze if you didn't say it. And of course we know from the Rebbe's Torah in general, the Rebbe is very much always emphasizes side the machshava and side the halacha l'maisa, side the mitzvahs maisias, that it all is all part of one big package. You can't have one without the other, and this is something that's constant. So it's interesting that on the one hand that there's a parallel, and that it's almost like Nefesh Hachaim is covering the same ground as Tanya, making the same point. On the other hand, the Alter Rebbe is saying it as innocently, like, of course, and Nefesh Hachaim is saying it sort of bitingly, as if to thereby disprove Darkei Chassidus. And at any rate, the way the Alter Rebbe Taka explains it is that the dibur, what's the pu'ul of dibur? The pu'ul of dibur is that you're being metak in the guf, you're being mamshech on the guf. And the kavana is that it should be oila v'nichlal b'yichudi yisparach. So you can have the dibur without the kavana, and but you're still lacking a tremendous dimension of davening, and that's why you need the kavana. So to the Alter Rebbe, of course, if Kavana was the whole thing, you wouldn't need dibur. Why do you need dibur? Because Chassidus also emphasizes the avodah being attacked in the guf, and as Menachem Gimel points out, the Nefesh Hachaim doesn't present that as being the oiftu of dibur. The Hachaim says that you're being makashi your ruach and not your neshama. Here the Alter Rebbe is saying dibur also has such an important role to play according to Chassidus, because it's being mavar the guf, something that the Nefesh Hachaim void is discussing. So the dibur, according to Alter Rebbe, is being mavar the guf, and then you have the Kavana, which is what the Alter Rebbe Chassidus certainly emphasized most of the time, which was the experience of davening and the connection between the neshama and the likus. At any rate, back to Tikun Chatzos, as we see certainly from the evolution of Chassidus and Chassidus Chabad, it seems like the Shita was that Tikun Chatzos would be the kind of thing that there would not be a point to doing if Yitaka didn't have the Kavana. That's what we seem to see from the Metzias, that it was dropped, which I guess is part of what we are in the middle of discussing or want to discuss. So again, contrasting the different Shittas, the Menishchai, applying this concept of Dibur alone to Tikun Chatzos as well. Chaim Belazhiner, who never mentioned Tikun Chatzos, and Chabad, Chassidus, which might be someone of Mamutza, that was pro Tikun Chatzos, but with Kavana for everyone, and might not be pro Tikun Chatzos without Kavana. Now, we've really got so much more that I want to get to, and probably much that I won't get around to. And I guess we're going to jump back and forth a bit between different points that I want to cover of a more general nature, more specifically to Tikun Chatzos, specifically in the Chabad context. Like I said, I want to get back to the Siddur, maybe go through the Seder Tikun Chatzos as it appears in the Siddur. But right now I just want to call attention to a specific point. We mentioned that in Igeres HaTshuva, the Alter Rebbe is mitzayin to his Ha'ara Tikun Chatzos that's printed in the Siddur. And if you take a look at that Ha'ara Tikun Chatzos, and maybe we'll take a longer look at it later on, but towards the end, there's actually a very interesting passage. And the Alter Rebbe says, this ties into what we were quoting from the Gavriel about chassidic attitudes towards Tikun Chatzos, especially Barabim, and he presents it as the Chassidish Shita was that it shouldn't be Barabim. But actually, if you look in the Ha'ara, and it was printed in the Tafkuf Samachs, and Alter Rebbe is referencing it in the Igeres HaTshuva from the mid Tafkuf Samachs. So it's not even Epes an Alte Briv, an Alte Zach that was from earlier stages of the Chabad Hanhaga. The Alter Rebbe says, "Achar advarim v'ha'emes ha'ele, kol ha'chayil asher naga yiras Hashem b'libam, yasiru masve habusha." Don't be ashamed. Don't be embarrassed. Vis asfu agudos. You should gather in groups, asara oipaches, groups of 10 or fewer, oyafilu b'yechidus, or even alone. Yasu kaseder Tikun Chatzos hanitbas b'sidurim, and you should do the Tikun Chatzos as printed in the Sidurim. So even though this Ha'ar is printed in the Siddur, but if you look l'mashal in the Siddur by Dayan Raskin, he points out that from this lashon it's mashma that this was written originally independently. The Siddur didn't exist yet, and the Alter Rebbe was telling the Chassidim to find the Seder from the Siddurim that are printed. And later the Alter Rebbe put it in the Siddur, and we'll talk about the Siddur, like I said, at greater length, and the Alter Rebbe's reaction to the Siddur after a subsequent reprint. There's a ma'aseh about that. But anyway, the point is, like I said, that this is something that, although it may have been written at an earlier point, it went into the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe saw it, reacted to the Siddur as it was printed once, a second time, and the Alter Rebbe references it in Tanya, like we said. So this is significant. This is a very interesting point, and it sheds some light on early Chabad practices. This isn't the only example of its kind of suggestions, hadrach of the Alter Rebbe, that sounds out of character with what we've become accustomed to. I believe Rabbi Shor, who writes, he's like the historian for Karl and Stalin, he's drawn attention to other passages where the Alter Rebbe talks about davening out loud, which is associated today more with Karl and Stalin, but there are a number of places where the Alter Rebbe seems to also advocate for davening in a lively, loud fashion. So this shouldn't be surprising to us, but you just have to be on the lookout and be ready to absorb these subtle differences and be able to make sense of them. And for more on a more well-rounded look into what was going on at this earlier stage of Chassidus, one place you could look is a book, Halachos v'Halichos b'Chassidus, by Harav Dr. Aaron Wertheim. It's an interesting little book. Shar Rishon, Yachas HaChassidus El HaHalacha, Shar Sheni, Madrega Chadasha, B'Hispatchos HaHalacha, Shinuyei Dinim u'Minhagim, Shar Shlishi, Hatfila, Ba'olam HaChassidus. So sort of looking at early Chassidus through this lens of the interaction between Chassidus and Halacha and minhag. So in that Shar Sheni, Shinuyei Dinim u'Minhagim, and the subsection Hashinuyim B'Chayav Haruchniyim Shel HaChassid B'Yimei Shavua, the first entry is Tikun Chatzos. It begins by mentioning there's an alter minhag to awake at Chatzos and to say Tfilas and Tachanunim. You have the Zohar, as we discussed, and it doesn't say it clearly, but as we know, it's the Arizal who introduced the Seder with the Tikun Rachel, the Tikun Leah, and crying about the geulah Shechina and the Churbanos. So the way he puts it is that Taanis Esther is following in the footsteps of Kabbalah. So, of course, they continued with this minhag of Tikun Chatzos. He points to sources such as in Savos Harivash, where it says, Lakum Tamid b'chatzos halayla, v'm'enei kam, v'hoya shalei machmas oynes, yehei lamayla b'nidei chas v'shalom. So very strong exhortation to make sure that you're up for Tikun Chatzos. Another passage there, K'shiyeh zor lakum b'chatzos, l'cha b'yom v'layla b'tayra, tefila yiskel adveikus. So Chatzos is definitely a theme. Although if we're nitpicking, it doesn't actually mention Tikun Chatzos, and the emphasis in the context there seems to be more about starting your day, starting your Seder Hayoim from Chatzos, and maybe that's worthy of a separate discussion. But perhaps my impression from this Sefer generally is that you have to sort of look after the specific sources, but it's a beginning, it's a point of departure for this topic. He says, you look in Remelech of Lizensk's famous Zettel Cotton, which are Remelech's Hadrachas. It says to say Tikun Chatzos. There's also a Seder Hayom of Rabbi Aaron of Karlin that's printed in Beis Aaron, and it says, Yizar Loimer B'chol Yom Tikun Chatzos Bein B'Kayetz U'Bein B'Chodev Afilu Lo Yiyeh Pnei Lumoid. So perhaps the tension between you getting up to learn or you getting up to say Tikun Chatzos, and it's important to say Tikun Chatzos even if it's at the expense of learning. Then he mentions the Alter Rebbe, and he sets it up as if it's Taka Pella. The Alter Rebbe chopped a lot of piyutim and tefillas out, and yet the Alter Rebbe is pro Tikun Chatzos, and he quotes from this Ha'ara and the Siddur from the beginning, Mudazois, Malas Kimas Chatzos, and then further on, this line, Yisasva Agudis. But it's not really that surprising, as I wanted to get to, which is because the Siddur is based on the Arizal, and the Arizal was Matak in this Indian, so if anything, it's probably a given that it's in the Siddur because it's part of the Nusach HaArizal, in my view. So again, Lav Dafka taking him for his specific insights, but I saw he quotes this lam, Yisasva Agudis. So, and quotes from Echel Lezansk, Maran Agadol, it just gives you some wider context for what was going on then Taka at the beginning, Bereshis HaChassidus. And he himself acknowledges that despite all these azharas, doesn't look like Chassidim have been keeping it up, and the question is, what happened and why? And even tzaddikim from the previous dur, what he calls the previous dur, they're still mentioning it positively, although it seems at this point that they weren't doing it anymore, so what happened? And of course, this question is also specific to Chabad, and it's one of the topics that I keep on brushing up against, and I still want to get to. But interestingly, he mentions here, and this will tie into some of the topics I want to talk about as well, that he says, Chassidic Chernobyl say b'shem the Rebbe, the Maggid, the Motto of Chernobyl, who said that Tikun Chatzos is keneged the Chavlei Mashiach. And we don't have to request something that we've already arrived at, because these years, the years we're presently in, are already the years of Chavlei Mashiach. And that's why in Chernobyl they used to say Vikarev Kates Mashiach instead of Vikarev Mashiach, because we've already accomplished Vikarev Mashiach. We already have the beginning of Mashiach. Now we have to daven for Vikarev Kates Mashiach. What's his makar for this? In the footnote, Al Pi Hashmum Miziknei Chasidim. Now, of course, that's anyone who says that Tikun Chatzos is no longer necessary because we're closer to Mashiach, you're entering very iffy territory, as we shall soon see and discuss. And this is a a touchy subject that goes back a few hundred years. He's just wondering whether this is the makar for Chassidim moving away from this minhag, and he says that can't be the reason, that can't be the source of when it stopped, because he says even in the Einikel, Magen Avram of Trisk, which is printed many decades later, it says ubeisa kitze mishnase bechatzes laila davka ki oz eden raiva mishtakach kayadua ki beavodas chatzes laila betoyer betikn chatzes, etc. So it sounds like Avram of Trisk is still talking about tikn chatzes as a davar shebahoiva. So that shmua about Ramatal nishta zeh pashat, and like I mentioned previously, not every shmua of Chassidim should necessarily be taken tzimtzum kupshutai. It could maybe be an indication as to what the sprach was and what people were saying, what Chassidim were chazering, etc. Like I said, the context of the Nefesh Hachaim, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% accurate to the date and the time, and then that's when they stopped. And let me just correct myself. The quote that I just read before about Be'esa Kitzoi, is actually a Torah of Ramatal Chernobyl himself that was printed by his Einikel in the Sefer Likutei Torah of Ramatal Chernobyl. So, in the Torah of Ramatal himself that's on the record, he's still alluding to Tikun Chatzos. And in addition, one of his sons, Avram of Trisk, in Magen Avram, says, "B'chatzos laila, tzarach kol mi shenaga yiras Hashem b'lavav v'lekumim meshkav v'yilomer Tikun Chatzos v'livkos al shnei batei migdash shenechravu." So you see that Sayyid Amatal, Sayyid son of Avram, are still talking about Tikun Chatzos as a davar shebahoiva. So it's not so simple. He also mentions in a footnote that even more recently, there's still Yeshivas Geulah, that we're still trying to follow the divrei Rabbi Seim Harishonim. So he's mitzayin to Mishmer Shalom Kaidanov, who's still trying to figure out what the proper, correct time is for Tikun Chatzos, and working out whether you can start early, etc. We're not getting into that particular discussion. Back to the Tikun Chatzos Ba'asara in Chabad, Heichal Baal Shem Tov, issue number Tezayin. There's an article that cites from Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson in Zikaron L'Bnei Yisrael that Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson describes in a Tafesh Ayin Aleph. Rav Shlomo Zalman Havlin visited Zheravitz, and he farbrang there, and he's saying the Nigun Dveikus Maharil, and there was someone present there, his name was Hachaim the Shamish, who had been a Malamed in his youth in Zheravitz, and when he heard this Nigun, it brought back memories of Maharil, the Alter Rebbe's brother's own visit, when he had sung this Nigun himself, and he started crying, and he started sharing his memories of that visit of Maharil and the greatest Eiris among the Chassidim, and he added the specific detail for color that he remembers that Maharil, Alter Rebbe's brother, had gepravet Tikun Chatzos Ba'asara on that visit. So a bit of a historical snippet of how Taka, the Alter Rebbe's circle, was being mekayim this halacha l'maisa. And of course, like I said, there are more mekayos that speak to the development of the attitude towards Tikun Chatzos within Chabad throughout the Deiros, and that's something that I still want to circle back around to. But I want to jump now to the Chida, that Chida that we mentioned earlier, about describing the minhag, the atmosphere in Yerushalayim. Now, the way this Reb Pinchas Zvichi quoted that passage from the Shem HaGedolim, so he quotes the part about Akol Mis'ablam al Churban, okay, but he continues quoting, he quotes the entire, or at least that entire passage till the end, and the passage concludes, Gam ein loimden be'ir HaKodesh b'divrei Kabbalah ki im hashmeina she'arim shehutku mekisvei Reb Chaim v'tal atzmoi u'benoi. And I'm just looking at it, I was looking at it, I'm not figuring this out now, but I was taking a look at it a few days ago, and I was just wondering what's the connection? And anyway, what was the Chida's point? Why was the Chida even talking about the minhag in Yerushalayim with Tikun Chatzos? And what does it have to do with Kitzur Takvei Koyin? But so this is what I want to delve into a bit. If you take a look, a real good look at that erech in Shem HaGedolim, and if you look around, there are others who discuss this and elaborate and clarify. What is Kitzur Takvei Koyin? Who authored the Kitzur Takvei Koyin? So, if you read the Shem HaGedolim quickly, you might miss it, because he never says the name outright. He writes Maharari, Rashi Tevis. So let's take a slower look at this entry of Kitzur Takvei Koyin. Kitzur Takvei Koyin. So the original Takvei Koyin is Shechiber Hagoyin Hashach B'dinei Tfisa. Kitzroi Hagoyin Maharari. Who's the Goyin Maharari? B'Sefer Urim V'Tumim Shechiber Al Choshen Mishpat. Who's the Mechaber of the Urim V'Tumim? Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. Also, Kitzer Tokve Kain, he describes it. And then, while he's at it, the Chida says, V'chiber, Sefer, Kresi Uplesi, Al Yeredeya, V'nitpes Chelik Beis, Al Chis Nida, V'nitpes Yaris Dvash, Beis Chalokim Perushim. So here, essentially, is where the Chida devotes a passage to Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. Now, is that just an innocent discussion? Is that just an innocent topic? No, not exactly, because we know that, especially in the Chida's own lifetime, Yonasan Eibshitz was the source of a lot of controversy. So the talk is a hamshich. Now the original Shem HaGedolim was printed in different sections, and the Shem HaGedolim as we have it today is all combined and consolidated. So I didn't go and look up to see if this was all printed in one hamshich originally or it's pieced together. But in the Shem HaGedolim as it's printed now, often what they'll do is if the Chida goes off on a tangent, they print the tangent in smaller letters. And this happens in different places throughout Shem HaGedolim. This is one of those places. So in smaller letters, in the edition that I'm looking at, the Chida writes as follows. We made Charpi, when I was young, Bisman Harav Agadol Saba Kadisher Bitzak HaKoyen, the Bati Kahuna, when he was the Rav in Yerushalayim, one of the Rebbeim of Chida, Nishma'a Keren Mochama, Ki Rabim Loichamim Bigoene Ashkenaz Im Mahari HaNizker. We heard the echoes of this big Mochama against Mahari, against Rabbi Yonasan. But Rabbani Goene Ira Kodesh Lo Yadu Amitas Hadvarim Ulahechon Magiyim Umativan Shelanyanim. And the Rabban Eretz Yisrael, they didn't really know what was going on. They didn't know what's really happening, and Hechon Magiyim, how far, what's the significance, and what's happening. So what we're seeing is that the Chida is feeling a certain degree of discomfort here. He mentioned Rabbi Yonasan, and now he feels like he has to address the machlekas. And the way he addresses it is by saying that we heard about it and we sort of didn't know what to say, what to think, and he sort of leaves it at that. And then from there, he segues into the passage under discussion. And that's the context. And here the Chida says, V'da ki ba'ara kadisha le'nimtza ish mefakbek al shum devar Torah v'razal chas v'shalom. You should know that in Eretz Yisrael, we don't have these problems. No one is doubting anything in Torah. Chas v'shalom. V'akoyel mis'ablem ala churban ba'aveinis ravim. We all mourn the churban which occurred due to our sins. U'mis'amtzim loymar kol layla Tikun Chatzos shesida Rabbeinu Harizatzal. And we all make an effort every night to say Tikun Chatzos that the Arizal was mesader. So again, the Chida is speaking very circumspectly about the situation, but he's acknowledging what he assumes the readers might be familiar with about what the nature of the Milchama against the Rebbe, as the Welt calls him, the Rebbe Rabbi Yonasan. He's not saying one thing or the other. He just feels compelled right now to stick up for Bnei Eretz Yisrael. He just wants to say that whatever the story was over there, we don't have these problems. Here in Eretz Yisrael, we're clean, we're free of these problems. You wouldn't find anyone in Eretz Yisrael that might be worthy of suspicion, might come under suspicion that they're skipping. What might they be skipping? They might be skipping Avelis for the Churban. They might be skipping Tikun Chatzos. I'm telling you, everyone's besabel, and we go and we say Tikun Chatzos every night, implying that you might expect that there would be others out there who are worthy of suspicion, who might not be saying Tikun Chatzos every night. So if you want to know if someone's worthy of suspicion or not, go check whether they're misabel, go check whether they say Tikun Chatzos. In Eretz Yisrael, we all say it, so we're all good. This is what is bothering the Chida, and this is how the Chida is seeking to address it. And then the Chida goes on and says, V'yesh Chevdas Anshi Chayil, shekamu b'teim kol layla b'chatzos, le'medrash kadosh, this group of special people that they gather in the medrash, the base medrash, they say Tikun Chatzos, the kinas soifrim, Tarba is using his militzas, and they cry. Umargla b'pumayu d'rabanan, there's a pun, a militza that everyone says, Ashrei kol choytzei, instead of kol choytzei, Ashrei kol choytzei. Ashrei, fortunate are those who make it to the halfway mark of the night to say Tikun Chatzos. And then he adds, with relevance to our discussion, to be made, Bein Hametzarim, Bebeis HaKnesses HaGedolah, Kilas Kodesh, Talmud Torah. Now, what are these names? What are these references? So it's just a random idea that back in Yerushalayim, the Sfardim had 4 old shuls. One was Kilat Kodesh Gadol, aka Birchnim and Zakeh shul. Another was Kilat Kodesh Talmud Torah, aka Eliyahu Novi Shul. One was Kilat Kodesh Hametzarim, aka Kal Tzion, and one was called Kilat Kodesh Achitzon, otherwise known as Istanbulis. So those were the 4 shuls. So that's what the Chida is saying in the geulah and in Talmud Torah. Those 2 shuls, Nosafim Bayoim Bein Hametzarim, they gather by day, Kahal Gadol, a large group, Mekayim Meboichim B'chol Yoim, they follow mitzvahs Rabbeinu Harizal, V'kama Prishois Noegim Al Talmidei Chacham B'mei Ben Hametzarim, and the talmidei Chachamim go out of their way to really experience the feeling, the spirit of Bein Hametzarim, Kechol Chumnus HaNimtzarim B'Sfarim V'Yosef V'Yeser. So the Chida is Pasha taking tremendous pains to emphasize that I'm telling you, it's like I promise, the Yidden of Yerushalayim, you take Bein Hametzarim seriously. Because it sounds like you're suspicious that they don't. So I'm telling you, we follow the Arizal, we gather in the middle of the day, and all the other Chumras associated with Bein Hametzarim, very, very important, very, very dear to us. And then he continues and says, Gam ein leimden b'yera kodesh b'divrei Kabbalah ki'im hashmeina sh'arim. So now what's the context for that? What he's trying to say is that in Kabbalah, the Yeshivas Hamekubalim Beit prided themselves on following straight Arizal Kabbalah, Arizal Hachaim Betal, at the expense of even other Sifrei Kabbalah that were popular in Europe, including among the chassidic kreisen. So by emphasizing this, the Chida wishes to say that by having that emphasis, by having that protection, by avoiding other svarim, so automatically you also avoid perhaps iffier ideas that might be present in other svarim. If you stick purely to Chaim Betal, there's no way that you can go off course, you can go off track. Whereas who's to say when you're steeped in all kinds of other svarim that are ostensibly following the path of the Arizal, but who knows? So that is the context. He emphasizes the Tikun Chatzos. He emphasizes the Bein Hametzarim. And then he emphasizes that they stick mamash to the classics of the Arizal, because even within the Arizal's ksavim themselves, they avoid this. Like I mentioned earlier, there are different maduras, different sdarim. They want to make sure they have the most authorized kisser of Chaim Betal, the Shmeina She'arim, which weren't even popular and common in Europe. Bechlal at that point, they were only more readily available in Eretz Yisrael at the time. But Tzrachti Lichtev Zen, he concludes and he says, and why do I have to write all this? Yan Re'isi, because I saw the Talu Buki Sidiki B'Yeshve Eretz Yisrael, because people are saying other things to the contrary, are maligning, or slandering Yeshve Eretz Yisrael. The Kosov B'Sefer, and they wrote it, it's printed in a book, Shadul Humarayu, Nabach, Hashem should forgive them, but they're wrong, and this is what the Chida feels compelled to write in this passage. So we understand now a lot more where the Chida is coming from, but what's Taka the Sefer, and why is he feeling compelled to dafka say this in the entry for Kitzur Takvei Kayin? So the answer is, if you look in the book Shluchei Eretz Yisrael by Avram Yari, who does this massive work, this massive job, going into the documentation and the history relating to the Shluchei Eretz Yisrael, the Shadarim that were sent throughout the centuries to Chutz La'aretz. Chida himself was a Shadar, and their relationships and their connection with Chutz La'aretz and their influence. So one of the chapters in the book, chapter 6, is Shluchei Eretz Yisrael Utnuos Ruchnius B'Yisrael. So interactions, connections to various spiritual movements. Interestingly, the second section there is Chalkom Shel Shluchei Eretz Yisrael B'Chipusei Aseres Hashvatim U'Behafatzas Yediyas Aleim. Someone he asked me a few days ago about the history and the attitudes towards the existence of Aseres Hashvatim, and there's actually some interesting documentation here about Shluchei Eretz Yisrael and this whole Aseres Hashvatim thing. That's not our focus here right now. Section Gimel is Hafatzas HaKabbalah HaEretz Yisraelis, their part in spreading the Kabbalah from Eretz Yisrael. Then Aizdal is Shluchei Eretz Yisrael U'Tnuas Shabtai Tzvi. Now we're obviously not getting into all of that, but he goes through that. He gets to Pulmus Chiyun, the parsha of Nehemiah Chiyun. Then he gets to Pulmus Ramchal, the whole parsha with Ramchal. And then he gets to what he calls Pulmus Apeshitz. And he says, in the fight, the controversy against Rebbeinu and Apeshitz, with the Kameas, etc., with the Yaakov Emden, there were 3 Shluchei Eretz Yisrael who were involved, and all 3 sided with Rabbi. The first was Rabbi Avraham Yisrael, a Shliach of Yerushalayim. not necessarily a household name, but he was an authentic, legitimate shliach of Yerushalayim, and he had ended up in Hamburg, Taka, which was part of the center of the Machlekes, and he wrote a pretty forceful document supporting Rabbi Yonasan and saying this whole attempt to open kameas and try to decipher them. Whoever heard of such a thing, just don't open the kameas and don't decipher them, and everything will be fine. And if you continue with this path, we have no choice. We're going to have to be machrim everyone in front of the Kolel Amaravi and the Kivrei Aviseinu and Chevron for all those who are starting up with this going. Very sharp. This is a letter he wrote in Tovkuf Yud Beis in 1752. So this document was very helpful for Rabbi Yonasan's case. A shliach of Eretz Yisrael. Not that anyone necessarily knew who this shliach was, but speaking in the name of Eretz Yisrael carried power at the time. So this caused some problems, some discomfort for Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his campaign. Obviously, he wasn't intimidated and swayed by the shliach of Eretz Yisrael, but now there's this extra thing standing in his way. So in one of the pamphlets from this controversy, Shviras Luches HaOven, which I believe was in response to the Luchas Eidos supporting Rabbi Yonasan. So Yaakov printed Shviras Luchas HaOven, and he describes how first he tries to call the document into question, call into doubt, maybe it's not authentic, maybe it's not real. But then Yaakov Emden also takes the other argument, which is that, you know what, maybe this is telling us something about the state of affairs in Eretz Yisrael in general. And here's where he really starts going after Eretz Yisrael. This appears, like we said, in Shviras Luchas HaOven. Etzra Chachma apparently doesn't have Azalch pamphlets in their database, but HebrewBooks.org does have. Generally, as I recall, they tend to have all the Pashkavilim from this parsha, so you can find it there. And it's on Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis, Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph. And Yaakov Emden writes towards the end of Mem Hey Amud Beis that I'm blowing the whistle on this. People should know that Bnei geulah are being nichshel. We're supporting people from Eretz Yisrael who aren't worthy. And here he starts saying, the letters are very unclear, but I think it says, Chas v'shalom mikat to the Shoazu, that most people from those lands are taka Chas v'shalom from this kat. So, which supports a larger point about how the Kanos really seem to be from Artis Ashkenaz, Yaakov Emden and others like him, were fire and brimstone against any Zeicher, and in the Artis of Svara, the Svardische Länder, Bnei HaMizrach, Eretz Yisrael, they were a lot more tolerant, even if they didn't actually support it. And Yaakov Emden apparently took that to mean that they are supportive. He didn't allow for that type of attitude. So if you're not against it, if you're not fire and brimstone against it, so you're for it. So Roiv Anshe Oisen Aratzis, he says, are from this kat. Although he qualifies it, and he says he's really saying so based on the basis of it's a whole parsha that he wrote a haskama for Mikdash Melech, but he really didn't like the Sefer Mikdash Melech, and Mikdash Melech is pro Chemdas Yamim, and he's anti Chemdas Yamim, so he wrote against Chemdas Yamim, and then he says, this Meshulach said, what, you wrote against Chemdas Yamim? You can't print that, because whoever sees that you wrote against Chemdas Yamim, they're going to throw it into the fire. So if we are to believe this claim, so Kum Tachois, it could only mean one thing. If they are pro Sefer Chemdas Yamim, that means that they're all members, Pashut, of this kat. And he says, it can't mean anything else, because anybody has just a yediyah b'miktzas, you got to pick up on it. You got to pick up on the minus of shots that's in the Sefer Chemdas Yamim. It's in the gematrius in every line, and the mechaber is the Navi HaSheker. This is part of the whole discussion as to who the author was, and it used to be common to believe that Nassan of Azza himself was the mechaber Chemdas Yamim, in part because there are piyutim in there that have his name in the acrostic, so it was assumed that he was mechaber the whole thing. So you can see the Ramazim, and the mechaber himself is Nassan himself, at least according to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. So he says, Oy lanu ki chatanu, and this is what we're supporting, this is the money we're sending to Eretz Yisrael. So he's starting, because of his anger at the support from innocent Eipshitz, so he starts going after the whole financial model that we're supporting Eretz Yisrael. This is what we're financing, this is what we're supporting. And then he starts sharing anecdotes about Ashkenazim who came to Eretz Yisrael, and they got into fights with the locals over the Sefer Chemdas Yamim. To them, Chemdas Yamim was treif, and everyone there, they said, we don't know what you're talking about. Then he shares another anecdote of how there was supposedly a Meshulach from Tiberia who, when he was told that someone's being gereideft, I'm not sure if he's referring to Rabbi or someone else, but the person was saying, they're going after me, they say I'm a believer. So the Mashalach said, no, ma bekach, what's the big deal? There are a lot of people like that. No one's upset about it, no one goes after them, no one gives them a hard time. He's trying to calm him down like this. So Dr. Yaakov Emden, it's true, then it's better to stay in Chutz La'aretz, melirois ervas ha'aretz, to go to a place where this is what they're saying, this is what they're describing. And he adds, this is the reason why Adoini, and I believe, I didn't check it again, but I believe Shivras Luchas Ha'aven is written in the third person, as if it's a Talmud of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, whereas I think it's understood that it really is Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself writing in the third person. So the narrator says, that's talking why my Rebbe can't consider living in Eretz Yisrael now, even though he always wanted to, because this is the situation. So again, this is a warning to Hachaim b'nei geulah. They have to put a stop to this. They have to fix this. This shouldn't be making things worse. We're supporting Eretz Yisrael because we think it's the right thing to do, and this could be adding avedas. We're supporting Machishe Munaseinu, Mefirei Bris Aviseinu, Noiche Teiras Imenu, Machale Shem Alekeinu, Letehei Kazais B'Yisrael. And they're taking our money, and this is what the money is going to. It's going to be Marech Argalos. We have to make a gather. We have to make sure we're not being nichshel with these people. And Lahorik Birchas Hatztokas, La'aris La'ashpachas V'Shalom. There has to be a Chakira, Drisha Me'ula. We have to do an investigation. We can't just rely on these letters. We have to send our own investigators, special investigators, Chachamim, Yidum B'Torah, B'Yira. They're going to go to the land and make an investigation. And anybody who's discovered to have the Sefer Chemdas Yamim in his house, so we're going to make a blacklist of anyone who has the copy of the Sefer in their house, and certainly whoever has Mamish Kisvei Minus Mishat Shem Shem Yerkav Talmido V'Siyatu Harura Kenos Azati Cardozo Brachia Malach Chiyun Lutzato Ebeshetzer. He has them all B'Chad Amachta. Anyone on this list, if you have any of their ksavim, you're on the blacklist as well. V'Chol Hanoegim Minhagim V'Shenimtza B'Shema Tereach of Shmiras Yemei Eid Shel Shat Shem Shem Yerkav. They observe any of their holidays. Ein Tzarech Loimar Misha Einem Misabel Al Yerushalayim. And here's the point that we're trying to get to. We discover anyone who's not misabel. Ve'enam Sheimin Yemei Atzemis V'Zeh Kosam. V'Anoigim Shum Kalos Roish B'Divrei Chachamim. That's the language that they're being mezalzel on Divrei Chachamim. Ein Tzarech Loimar. That's B'Divrei Chachamim. Ein Tzarech Loimar B'Shal Torah. Never mind if it's a Deiraisa. And then he goes even further. Pshita, if there are those hanachshadim al harayas v'hanida, if they're being makel at all in that, afilu b'syagas shel devreim, even if it's not mamish being beilei nidus, but being mezalzel in the syagas. So he says we need to set up an inquisition. We need to out all of these people who are nechshad al minuzu, bein begolui, bein this, bein that, in any form. We have to then publicize them, Hashem. We have to write a full report. There will be a full commission, a report to the geulah with all the information, and then we'll know who we're dealing with, and we're not going to allow these people to sneak in. And that's how he concludes. We have to be matak and everything outside the Yisr Toy, but if in nos. So this is how Rabbi Yaakov Emden responds to that Shadar's letter. It literally went, Kaviyachol is declaring all-out war against the Yeshivas Hamekubalim Beit, and he accuses them all of being closet Sabbatians, one way or the other, whether they have the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, never mind if they have ksavim from all the other people that he considers would be much worse, and never mind if they're mezalzel in being misabel and the tzaimis, and never mind if they're mezalzel in arayas and nida. And so that was the context. And now, when you look back at the Chida, the Shem Agdoilim, so now you mamish see how it's mamish such a direct response to this very, you could say, rant from Yaakov Emden. And that's the context as to why it's in the Erech of Kitzur Tak V'Koyin, which is where Yaakov Emden decided to write about Rebbe and Eibshitz. So he touches gingerly on the fact that there was Epis HaMachlekas, and we never figured out, we never got to the bottom of it here in Yerushalayim. And by the way, if you want to say anything about the Bnei Eretz Yisrael, Zok the Chida, So let me tell you that Ba'ara Kadisha loy nimtze ish mefakbek al shum dvar Torah v'razal v'hakoil mis'abel ala churban u'mis'amten loy mekol layla Tikun Chatzos. And those that get up every night and say Tikun Chatzos in the Beis Medrash, and B'mei Bein Hametzarim, we gather and we go above and beyond Kama Prishos, Kol HaChumres, and you're talking about Ksavim, the Ksavim that people have, this one, you gave me a whole list. We in Eretz Yisrael, we go to the extreme. We only have the Shmoina Sha'arim and Vesuloi, even in Kisvei Ari, Racheshish for other Sdarim, what Tzarachti Lichtav Zayan Re'isi, the Talu Buki Sriki, B'yesh Eretz Yisrael, the Kosov B'Sefer. Who wrote it in the Sefer? Now we know. Now the funny thing is, ironically though, the Chida doesn't really address or acknowledge the fact that the thing about Chemdas Yamim was kind of true, because Taka Chemdas Yamim was very popular in Eretz Yisrael and those Aratzes. What each person thought about it, whether they thought that Nassim was the author or not, or how they contended with it, Lav Dafka was so simple and straightforward, and Lav Dafka everyone had the same thought and view and opinion. But it is likely that it was more common to say, you know what, we're not going to go there, we're not going to touch it. That itself should not be considered an admission of support for the movement in any which way, shape, or form necessarily. We know the Chida himself, from his Yemanim, we know that he would use the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, he would review the portions of the Sefer Chemdas Yamim in relation to whatever the time of the year was for inspiration. So the Chida kind of sidesteps that when he says we only learn the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Yeah, it's true, and all these other names that Yaakov Emden lists, they were not learning their chiburim, unlike in Europe where it was much more popular to learn more eclectic chiburim from a variety of sources. But after the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, which Yaakov Emden uses as this scarlet letter, as a way of proving, exposing secret adherents, so as it happens, that Sefer was considered kosher, as he accused, as he alleged. And yet, as you see, the Chida is repudiating all the other accusations, and he's saying we're 100% into being mis'abel for the Churban and Bein Hametzarim, etc., etc. And yet, at the same time, and the Chida Taka never mentions Chemdas Yamim in Shem HaGdailim, so he avoids the issue by just sort of never talking about it, but we know that they did use it. So things just simply aren't that black and white, they aren't so simple. And as we said, ironically, the Chemdas Yamim Taka doesn't mention Bein Hametzarim, so they're using Chemdas Yamim that doesn't mention Bein Hametzarim, but the very Nizr in Bein Hametzarim. Of course, it could be they were using the edition that had the Yosafa for Bein Hametzarim, so it wasn't as noticeable and palpable. And there's more to add, by the way, on the whole topic of Chemdas Yamim Bein Hametzarim, and you still have the Chemdas Yamim defenders in this day and age, and those who are refuting what those defenders say. Maybe we'll get around to it in the follow-up to the previous thing, maybe not. But it's just interesting how these topics are all connected and intertwined. And now this brings us back to the phenomenon of those who did perhaps suggest that there should be shinuyim, or that we should stop doing certain things. So you have well-known, confirmed adherents of Shabtai Tzvi who made shinuyim with Bein Hametzarim and with Tikun Chatzos, which is suggested by the Chemdas Yamim's omission as well. You have that. You have, like I mentioned, this vart that he is miyachas to Chernobyl about the cut of Kates Meshiche, so that's treading closely to that. In the article I mentioned in the beginning from Stiglitz, he has a section there about talmidei Hagra, and there being a controversy over them and what they did or didn't want to say from Tikun Chatzos, or even perhaps related to Bein Hametzarim. And then, interestingly, there's even proper, straightforward, mainstream Mekubalim from Yeshivas Hamekubalim who also had apparently certain hashmatas in Tikun Chatzos v'chadayma. So it's actually a lot more interesting and a lot more complex, and we're only scraping the surface here. In terms of, we're talking about Tikun Chatzos, we're talking about Bein Hametzarim, nothing over here is so innocent, and there's a lot of tension underlying everything we're really discussing here. And now I just want to touch briefly on all of these points that I just mentioned, Chemdas Yamim, talmidei Hagra, and Mekubali Yerushalayim, and I think with that we'll conclude and pause this installment, and we'll have to leave the many other aspects, especially with the relation to Chabad, Tikun Chatzos and Chabad, for part 2. So just for a bit on the Chemdas Yamim angle and the absence and the significance. So in the last 20 years, like I said, there have been defenders, and then there have been those that have been pushing back. So a number of Kunteresim Svarim have been printed. There's a whole new edition of Chemdas Yamim, which perhaps I should admit, I actually obtained the volumes of the new edition of the Chemdas Yamim. I have them in my house. I guess Rabbi Yaakov Emden would have some choice words for that. I can't say that I got it because I'm a major adherent, but it just seems like it has historic significance, and it just seems like a sefer that's useful to have around. I don't know why I'm defending myself, but I guess for full disclosure, I do have, I don't know if it's the full new edition or the new edition covered the entire thing yet or not, but I have halakim of that in my house. And in there they defend Chemdas Yamim, and they claim that it was nischaber by someone who wasn't associated with the Shabtai Tzvi and the Makrish, all the connections. And then you have Kunteresim that are attacking that. So one of the Kunteresim is Eresh Chemda, Oidus Chemdas Yamim by Ariel Ephraim Aharonov, who's a big name in the new wave of Haredi semi-academic young elite that write in a pretty academic fashion. But he's a shtuckle kanos against the Chemdas Yamim defenders, so he printed this kuntrus. And one of the things he talks about is how Chemdas Yamim has this whole discussion about the years Tav Chav Tes, Tav Lamed, the significance of those years, and that was the height of the tension when the Sabbatian movement was suffering reversals. He was still alive, but things weren't going according to plan. So, on the one hand, they believed that they had made progress. So he says, for that purpose of proving that, he says that Yaakov Sasportas, the sworn enemy of the movement, in Tzitz Nevel Tzvi, so he says in Tav Chavav, he had already abolished the Sar B'Tevis and turned it into a Yom Tov. And the next year, the year after that, they abolished all the other Tzeimus, including Tisha B'Av, they turned them into a Yom Tov. And that was considered a Shas Ratzin, Yom Mashiach, so all out the window. We're preparing for Kabbalah's Pnei Mashiach, even if the geulah will still be delayed for a number of years. And those years of Tav Chav Tes Tav Lamed, so he's just trying to explain how you could believe in the whole Torah that we just said, and yet also be sort of writing in a more rueful, wistful style about how Mashiach feels out of reach. Where's Mashiach? Why is Mashiach not coming? When you say that, it didn't mean that you weren't a believer. It meant that you dafka were a believer, and yet, so now you're wondering what's happening. But that still fits very nicely with Bittul HaTzeimus. Later in the Kuntrus, he responds to Reb Chaim Palachi. Reb Chaim Palachi famously went on the record defending the Chemdas Yamim and going on the record about how the Kabbalah, the Messiah was, not to say good or bad about the whole Parsha, and that's who the Munkatcher is attacking. I mentioned last time about how Rabbi Yosef is defending his use of the Chemdas Yamim, also behemshech to that Shita, to that Kav, although in that case he was defending the use of the part of Chemdas Yamim that isn't from the Chemdas Yamim, but he was defending the Chemdas Yamim in principle against the Munkatcher who attacks Reb Chaim Palachi, who defended the Chemdas Yamim, Chad Gadya. Anyway, so Reb Chaim Palachi defends the Chemdas Yamim in various ways. And this Aronov is sort of responding and refuting Reb Chaim Palachi as well. So Reb Chaim Palachi actually addresses the absence of Hilchos Bein Hametzarim. So Reb Chaim writes, Gama she'emidim al Sefer Chemdas Yamim shelo yesh le Hilchos Bein Hametzarim b'inyan ha'churban. But Hilchos Pesach, he mentioned something about you should cry on Pesach, about the Churban, at Chatzi Alayla of Pesach, and we have to daven about Galus. So Aronov responds and says that if someone who's Bucky and their Titus would understand that it makes sense on the one hand that Bein Hametzarim is missing, is absent, because they weren't observing it, and it still makes sense for them to be acknowledging the Churban because they believed on the one hand they'd reached the stage of being without the Bein Hametzarim, but they still acknowledge the fact that there's still Galus, have the Mashiach, the Churban. They didn't believe that Mashiach had come and built the Beis Hamikdash. So that's where they were at. That's taka where they were holding. And then later in the Kuntrus as well, he points out that even in the Chelek, forget about the part of Bein Hametzarim missing. When you get to El Tishrei, and it goes through it step by step by step, all of a sudden you notice that some Gedalia is missing, as if it doesn't exist. And again, the only reason in this case you wanted to say the defenders say maybe the part on the Tzemis was missing, maybe it existed, it just somehow it got lost in the shuffle. But here you have the whole Hemshech of El and Tishrei, and some Gedalia doesn't exist. Says that tells you what you need to know. Taanis Esther, which is the one Taanis that's not connected to the Churban. So Shabtai Tzvi's adherents weren't against fasting at all. You want to fast for other reasons? Taanis Esther is fine. So Taanis Esther gets treated normally. But any other Taanis related to the Churban never gets mentioned in any which way, including some Gedalia, which you would expect. Hachaim not Bein Hametzarim and Tisha B'Av. He says, so you can't defend and say, oh, maybe some Gedalia is also missing because he was going to discuss the Tanya separately, which doesn't really actually fit with the way the Sefer is broken up. But even if you're going to try to claim that, no, say, why does he mention Taanis Esther? If you're not mentioning some Gedalia because you're saving it, so don't mention Taanis Esther either because you're saving it. No, Taanis Esther, he mentions, has a whole parak devoted to Taanis Esther and in his unique style, 3.5 pages going on and on. Some Gedalia, garnished. And again, they have nothing wrong with fasting. So other fast days, Tamid, the Chassidus, you want to fast in El, that he also talks about. But anything to do with the Churban, Tzaimus of the Churban, Bein Hametzarim, completely gone. So that just establishes how even the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, which even the Chida accepted, and it seems like Taka come out all the geulah and chashuvim in that part of the world, Taka stuck to, and they found it so beautiful and inspiring and amazing. But that you see the shayrish, you see the aside of this deletion, this absence, this omission very clearly there. So that's our baseline for the attitude in which these things don't exist anymore. Now let's go back to Stiglitz and Sinai about Tikun Chatzos. So he says there was a Sabbatian story that says that in the year Tafyat Zayin in Zayas, that was when the Shechina stood up, right? Because the Shechina is said to be lying in the dirt and the ash. So the Shechina stood up, and so Tikun Rachel is abolished. We can't be metakin Rachel anymore. We be metakin the Shechina. It's all fixed. It happened. Then he says, many years later, and he's quoting Aryeh Morgenstern, who writes about talmidei and messianic beliefs, and I know that this parsha itself is controversial, and I'm not in a position right now to check myself and develop my own opinion. So just saying up front that this is Stiglitz basing himself on Morgenstern. So Morgenstern describes that there was suspicions concerning the talmidei the Perushim Yerushalayim. They skipped, or they were accused of skipping Hisnari Me'ofer Kumi and L'Chadeidi in Kabbalah Shabbos, and they eliminated the kinnis from Tikun Chatzos. Now, as we mentioned, Chabad Tzvi also doesn't have the kinnis in Tikun Chatzos, but others did say it, and they removed it. And this lasted for a couple of years, and then a few years later, in the year Tafresh Zayin, they reversed these chidushim. They brought back Hisnari. They brought back the full Tikun Chatzos. To be honest, it's not fully clear from his Kitzer if they had only omitted part of Tikun Chatzos, or they stopped saying it altogether, and then they brought the whole thing back. Either way, there was stuff going on that very much related to this theme. He mentions that there's a tie-in to missionary activity. There was active missionary activity in Yerushalayim among the Frum community, and apparently some members of the Perushim had been tempted and converted, and that caused a lot of shock and uproar. That's the story in a nutshell. There's probably a lot more to it, and it would be nice to see the documentation for all these claims in greater detail, but that's a thing that's out there. That's a story, a narrative that's out there about specific dynamics within the geulah of the Perushim, talmidei in Yerushalayim. And now finally, with reference to the Mekubali Eretz Yisrael, so Mechon Avat Shalom, Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, printed a few years ago, Michtav Me'Eliyahu, which was this correspondence between the Ben Ish Chai, Yosef Chaim in Baghdad, his correspondence and communication with the Mekubal, Reb Eliyahu Seleman Mani, who was in Hebron. And apparently it contains a lot of important yediyos in halacha, minhag, al pi Kabbalah, the correspondence between these two great rabbanim. So if you look there, you look at Shaila Hay, so Ben Ish Chai had asked, what's the minhag of the chassidim in Eretz Yisrael, Mekubalim, when they say Tikun Chatzos, when they say it in the Medrash? So there's a musig from the Arizal about changing your place, moving around during Tikun Chatzos. Do they do that also in the Medrash when they do it, or only when they do it at home? and Rabbi Mani responds and says whatever he says. So Yaakov Hillel in his footnotes is explaining and elaborating, and then he has a footnote there, a lengthy footnote that begins as follows. He says, once I'm at it, I have to acknowledge that there's something very, very shocking from Rabbi Mani in his Sefer Me'il Eliyahu, where he's explaining the Siddur Rashash, the Kavana Tikun Chatzos, and he says, V'koy yasa yeshav ala aretz, and then he says, Loyre isi misha oisazeh. Originally you're supposed to sit on the ground, but at this point the minhag was not to sit on the ground. But there's this idea of moving your place around. It says, V'shamaiti shebedoiris elu ein leishav ala karka v'lasas kasei derazeh. I heard that, we don't follow the original exact instructions, and particularly sitting on the ground, because we've made some progress, because the Shechina has been lifted a bit, so Tikun Chatzos has adapted accordingly. And Yaakov Hillel says, I'm shocked, I'm flabbergasted. How could the heilige Mensch, how can someone like that say such a thing? Doesn't this ring mamish of the kat hatzvi hashover? They're mavatal Tikun Chatzos, and they're mavatal the Tanya, and who went up to Shemayim and reported back that the Shechina was already oila, and we don't have to do Tikun Chatzos with all the dikdukim? Yaakov Hillel says, it's pella otzib to me, how Rabbeinu HaMechaber, who had das, Torah, Amitis, none like him, how did he get pulled in by these shmuis, made up stuff, these dangerous ideas, and with ideas like that, you can chas v'shalom be oiker, the ikrei HaTorah. And he says, out of respect and dignity for Rabbeinu B'lio Mani, I don't want to even elaborate further, but I can't hold myself in. So Rabbi Yaakov Hillel feels compelled that he has to almost excoriate B'lio Mani. He can't let it pass. He can't give B'lio Mani a pass. Lafi his das Torah and his hashkafa in this day and age, B'lio Mani crossed the line, and he has to be called out. And bar that based on these imaginary sevaras, we can't stop anything, we can't change anything from following Tikun Chatzos exactly the way that Arizal prescribed and the Rashash, and we have to do every single detail until Mashiach Taka comes properly. Then Rabbi Yaakov Hillel adds that this was always the simon. This is how you knew if someone was suspect or not. And then he starts quoting Taka the Chida, Shem Agdoilem, Kitzur Takfei Kohen, and he quotes much of what we discussed earlier. So he says, you see how the Chida, when he wants to defend Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, the best today is that they are mis'abel al churban kadin, no shemetz, no zecher of katshatz. Then Rabbi Yaakov Hillel is mitzayin to a sefer called Kinyan Peiris by Rabbi Didyer Rafal Abulafia, who is, you could say, seems to have been a contemporary of Rabbi Mani, also from the Yeshivas Hamekubalim Beit talmidei Rashash, and he's known as Hayare, that was his Rosh Tevis, and he had composed this work, Kinyan Peiris, Hakdomus, Uklolim, Benyani, Seder Kavana, Alpi, Rashash, and Mechon Avat Shalom printed this work as well. So he says, look at the last page. It's not such a long sefer. Look at the last page of Kinyan Peiris. What does Rav Abulafia write? He says, Be'inyan Amiris Tevis ad Mosai Uscho B'Shvi V'Sif Artucha B'Yad Sor. Where are these words from? The Nusach of V'Hurachim Sheni V'Chamishi. So he says, Shamati Ba'imrim. People are saying, Ki Al Pi Asoid Ein Lemer Tevis Elu. That according to Kabbalah, we don't say this anymore. When it's Parsim Adavar Ba'elam, and it's already well known, famous, Al Pi Kabbalah, we don't say those words. What's the reason? No one knows the reason, but V'yeshem Neistim Tam L'Davar, some say, we know what the reason is. Ba'imram. Shekvar Kama Shchinta Me'afra. You see that the Shechina stood up, and they bring a raya from the Beis Medrash, Yeshivas Hamekubalim, that the Taka don't say it, and it's Taka, that's the reason why they don't say it. Kivade Taimim B'nimukam, Sha'ata B'deiris Elo Achreidim, Samach L'geulah, Kvar Kama Shchinta Me'afra, Ubias Meshichenu, is Tolui B'Masenu, Tshuvasenu. He describes Taka how the minhag was at this point for a while not to say it, and they didn't understand why Taka, and obviously they had been saying it whatever it was 100 or 200 years before. So how did this Taka begin? Where did this come from? And then he says in Tafresh Vav, we got a letter from the Rabbanu Pekidei Eretz Yisrael in Amsterdam, led by Tzvi Herschel Leren. We know that there was the Pekidim and the Markelim in Amsterdam. It was a big organization that was very involved in financial activity, raising money for Eretz Yisrael. And Perushim was Taka, the leader, and he was also Bar Urian, and he had an interest in these inyanim. So they were reaching out, and they were Taka asking, they were curious, what's Taka the story? He says, Shama Mechacham, that had visited Amsterdam at the time, someone had stopped by and reported to them, yeah, that in Beis Sale we don't say these words. Is the Taka true? And that Chacham had told them, yeah, it's the reason is Yan Kvar Kama Shchinta Afra. So this is what people are going around saying. So they send a letter asking, is this Taka true? So he says, my Rebbe at the time told me, you got to get to work. They also felt probably had to give them a good answer. They couldn't ignore the question. They had to figure it out once and for all. He says, go look in Sifrei Rabbeinu Ari Chaim Betal. Is there any basis? He says, I looked. I didn't find anything. That as long as the Perushim are not completely in his bar. So first of all, in the terminology of the Kabbalah Sarizal, the Partsufim of Atzilus descend every weekday to be mislabish in the corresponding Partsufim in Biyah. And that itself is known as Golas HaShechina. And in addition to that, every night, Rachel, the Bechina of Rachel, descends to Biyah. And that's called Golas HaShechina. And she cries, and that's how the Arizal explains and describes it in his Drushei Halayla and Drushei Chatzos. So that is, in Arizal terminology, that is being Mala Birurim, and through the power of Tfilis, we're being Mekim, the Shchinta Me'afra. So this is so basic and integral to the whole model of Kabbalah Sarizal, of what's going on every day with the Tfilis and everything. So saying Kama Shchinta Me'afra throws the whole system into disarray. Wait a second, so what are the implications? What are we saying? And there, as he said, there is no trace of any such suggestion in Kabbalah Sarizal, or the Kabbalah Sarizal wouldn't work, wouldn't shtim. So he says, his Rebbe Taka said, you know what? The first marker that we can find, one of the Sifrei, Sidurei, Kavana Sarizal, that was the first to be mashmited, you know what? Maybe that's Taka not a good reason, not a good basis for us and the minhagim that we follow in Yeshivas Beis, because that particular sefer, Taka, is influenced by other Sfarim and other Chiburim that we shouldn't be relying on. For example, like Chemdas Yamim, or even Sefer Mishnas Chassidim, anything that contains ideas that are not from the Shmeina She'arim. Say, Bazai, how did it ever happen? How did we ever allow this change to slip in? It's against our principles of how we operate in the Yeshivas Hamekubalim. And he was very upset about it. Where did this minute come from? And he starts writing that maybe there's epis nachatam. Maybe we can explain it differently. And then ad kan nimtza b'ksav yad v'chasra hemshech. But at any rate, you have this fascinating testimonial about this period, Tafrei Shvav, so this is around the 1840s, this period in Yeshivas Yeshivas Hamekubalim, in which this minhag that crept in. Everyone is saying, Chachamim from the yeshiva are going around saying it's because Kama Shchinta Me'afra. The ramifications for Kabbalah Sarizal are huge, are immense, and no one's even really taking all of that into consideration. What's happening, what's going on? And this is causing all of this dismay and confusion, and they're fretting over it. It's just a very interesting snapshot in time in which they're caught between such a pervasive theme seemingly, and yet where did it come from, and is this legitimate or not, or worse? Now back to Yaakov Hillel. So after he quotes the Gantzazach, he says, what was that sefer? He says, the change was introduced by a sefer which in hindsight we were saying, that sefer actually has a lot of outside influences that we wouldn't approve of. What was that sefer? The sefer is called Chesed LaAvram. It was printed in Mantova, in Tafkuf Mem Gimel, 1783. Sefer Chesed LaAvram, Yishadasi B'Harei Kodesh, Kulam Achmadim, etc. Shleish Svarim Neftachim Boy, Seder Achayel, Eilas Shabbos, Eilas HaChodesh, and essentially it's based, you get the Kavanas that are Yotzim Mikisvi HaKodesh Moran Malka Kadisha HaAriel, which is another kinui for the Arizal, and it's Me'es Bini Ana Avram Tuviyana of Al Jazeera. Right, so obviously we know that there were many Sidurei HaArizal. There were Sidurei HaArizal that were prevalent in Europe, Sidurei Shabsa, Sidurei Asher, from the Chassidus Kreisen, back when Kavanas Arizal were also still a big thing among the early Chassidim. So this Rav Abulafia describing this whole thing with Admase Uscha B'Shvi V'Sefartchu B'Yatzar, he traced it back when they tried to figure out when did we first drop these lines. So I'll emphasize that line more. He writes, "V'tzarach ladas ki b'sidur harav chesed la'avram tviyana hanitpas al pi Kavana sarizal hishme tevis elu." Then later, when he says that his Rebbe realized what's going on here, he said, or whatever, whatever the Rosh Tevis is, but the fact that Rav Chesed Avram sheyesh mitoi ain't like kedai lanu, that's not enough. Lefi minhagim b'kak beisel. Yan kidibri Rav Chesed Avram rumen kekulam b'nuyim al sh'ar svarim shel talmidei harav harizal she'ein lusmach aleim. And like the Rashash writes at length about Chemdas Yamim Mishnas Chassidim sheyesh b'toichem dvarim shel nimtzu b'dibri Rav shmeinu she'arim. So then Yaakov Hillel follows up and says, I, for the record, will elaborate more on this. This is Avram Toviyana, who made the Siddur Chesed Avram. He follows specifically Shitas HaHolchem B'Darkam Shel Hakat Hatzvi HaShavor, as Rav Abulafia hinted, and Toviyana relies completely on Chemdas Yamim, follows the prescriptions of Chemdas Yamim. And this Hashmata Taka goes all the way back to the Chug of the Anshe Chemdas Yamim, and they were the ones who omitted this line from the Siddur because of their beliefs. It all Taka goes all the way back to them. So this means, and he's acknowledging himself, this means that in Yeshivas Beisel they had a minhag that went straight back, was Hashmata that went straight back to the Chemdas Yamim and that crew. And the reason that went along with it was literally the kind of reason that was fitting for that Hashmata. The two things were completely connected to each other. And that was in V'hurachim. So he says, Etli ein safek, when Rabbi Mani is repeating this theme with regard to Tikun Chatzos, it's clearly the identical shmua. It's just another variation of the same thing. And this is the origin, this is where it's coming from. And Yaakov Hillel is saying, I have to acknowledge, I have to admit, look how far the influence came, how much it penetrated. Ad la kodesh pnima mamash. And then Yaakov Hillel ties it into contemporary variations of this, Zionism, the Medina, and those that suggest that we should diminish the Avelis of the Churban, and the Nusach of Nachem. How can you say that it's Avela, Chareva, etc.? So he seeks to draw a certain parallel about how, Kfar Hayel Elamim, this other variation of it, in which he has no problem condemning, no matter where it comes from, whether it's sort of from Toviyana or B'li Mani. He's dafka going on the record and dafka documenting all of it and dafka calling it out, and that's, I suppose, his impression of what true Das Torah should be. He's taking a more purist approach, which Yaakov Emden would, I guess, fully support. And he's trying to apply that standard retroactively, which, as we see, isn't actually really a fair standard. And we see that Chemdas Yamim was very influential. And like I said, even when the Chida repudiates and says, we don't have any other Svarim, but they did have Chemdas Yamim. And back to Rabbi Yaakov Emden saying, sharing his suspicions, and Chida pushing back. So by Rabbi Yaakov Emden's standards, he was correct to some extent. It wasn't just the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, because look at this, not just Yaakov Emden is in the early Tov Kufs, this is the late Tov Kufs, the early Tov Reishas, and within Yeshivas Yeshivas Hamekubalim, they're still saying shmuas like this. So that means that there was some truth to what Rabbi Yaakov Emden said. But I would say that perhaps we should be a little more forgiving than Rabbi Yaakov Emden and perhaps Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, and be a little more tolerant. I'm not saying that we should endorse and say that Kol Mashkin to Me'afra. I'm not taking a stance on that question with major mystical ramifications, as we said, never mind the ramifications in terms of actual emunah and belief and what we call hashkafa today. But this certainly all paints a much more complex picture relating to Tikun Chatzos Bein Hametzarim, which is the subject that we're presently here to discuss, and how you find these themes creeping up, like I said, whether it's attributed to Chassidim, or attributed to talmidei Hagra, or smack in the middle of Yeshivas Beisel. It certainly tells a fascinating story. And obviously the fact that Tikun Chatzos went out of style Well, maybe if you believe that Kama Shchinta Me'afra, you could say, oh, look at that. Interesting how that's the trend the world went in, that they stopped saying Tikun Chatzos. But obviously that's not the standard reason that's given, certainly not in Chabad. And anyway, as we saw, the Alter Rebbe sort of turned it more into a personal Avodah thing, so the explanations given in Chabad focus more on that and on the state of Avodah and who it's appropriate for, as I guess we will, Amir Hashem, get to in part